Chapter 456. Previously, with a spurt of energy, the horses were also focused and courageously galloped, following the troops all the way back. It was only now that they felt that something was amiss. There were still many companions of the same species around them, but they were not aware of it. Now that the surviving steel cavalry had returned, the masterless warhorses were at a loss, their heads swaying left and right as they searched for their companions in fear. Am I not carrying the burden of my old comrade, whom I have always been so close to? Why aren't you riding me? Where have you gone? The warhorses neighed in bewilderment, stomping their hooves anxiously, hoping to find the face they were most familiar with in the crowd. Suddenly, a warhorse let out a long neigh and stood up on its hind legs. It turned its head and looked around, clearly trying to find its master. However, its eyes were filled with more and more fear, sorrow, and desolation. After some time, more than 2,000 warhorses neighed in anguish at the same time. When the sound fell into everyone's ears, they could not help but feel a heart-wrenching sorrow. Fu Baogua lowered his head in dejection. The 20,000 steel cavalry who had gathered and returned to the troop bit their lips tightly, keeping quiet as tears glistened in their eyes. Even the formation of the steel cavalry, which had never been disorderly, was a little disorganized. Many of the warhorses, carrying the empty saddles on their backs, began to move uncontrollably. The horses' noses twitched as they looked around in vain, searching for their companions, their masters. That kind of blankness, sorrow, and loneliness was truly mournful, a sight that struck one's heart with grief. Suddenly, a long neigh rang out. A warhorse left the troop, carrying the empty saddle on its back, and sprinting towards the battlefield like an arrow. The warhorse was sentient, obviously wanting to return to where its master had left it. It wanted to search for him, find him, be with him again, and carry him for eternity. With this warhorse leading the way, hundreds of other warhorses left the troop and galloped after it. The long mane on the horse's neck swayed in the wind, but it was filled with determination and solemnity. Stop them! Wang Dingguo was taken aback and hastily shouted, "We can't stop them anymore." Fu Baogua shook his head dejectedly and said, "They won't be coming back." The neighing of the warhorses echoed on the battlefield for a long time. On the other side, Dongshuan's troops were cleaning up the battlefield. Hundreds of warhorses charged over, completely ignoring the enemy's silhouettes as they searched carefully among the mess. They were so attentive and so duty-bound. Catch them! A deputy general in Dongshuan's army was overjoyed when he saw it. These were all steel cavalry warhorses, and any one of them was a fine steed that could only be picked out of 1,000. Such a large group of ownerless warhorses suddenly appeared. Isn't this a windfall from the sky? I've struck it rich. Dongshuan's deputy general, eager to hunt, immediately took a step forward and sprinted towards a horse that was obviously of the highest quality. With this person as an example, many Dongxian soldiers swarmed forward at once. Wait! When a middle-aged general saw this from afar, he knew something was wrong, but it was too late to stop him. Moreover, even if they had heard him, the soldiers who only had the desire to obtain a fine steed would not have bothered with him. At least hundreds of Dongxian soldiers had already charged forward, entangling themselves with the horses. "This one is mine! Haha, mine! Mine!" The hundreds of warhorses were searching for their companions with all their might. How could they hold it in when they were suddenly pulled and even ridden? They were unprecedentedly agitated, jumping around in a frenzy. With a long neigh, a warhorse that had been stolen onto its back leaped and bit as it charged towards Dongshuan's formation like it had gone mad. The horse's head was obviously slanted by the reins, but its eyes were filled with madness that had lost all sense of reason. Its speed was as fast as lightning. No matter what was in front of it, it only knew how to charge. All the warhorses neighed in agony, leaping and galloping madly. "Jump down! Jump down quickly! Jump down quickly if you don't want to die!" The Dongxian general roared in terror from afar, stomping his feet. These newbies really knew nothing. On the battlefield, who would dare provoke a warhorse that had lost its master? Such provocation was no different from courting death. These warhorses had already been destined to die. They had returned to the battlefield to die for their master. Life and death were no longer a consideration for these loyal warhorses. Jumping down from a galloping warhorse was extremely dangerous and could easily injure their tendons and bones, but it was still better than dying. It was just that many of the soldiers who had climbed onto the warhorses did not even have the time to jump down. The warhorses galloped like lightning, and the outcome was decided in an instant. Some of the warhorses crashed headfirst into the huge tree stumps. Not only did they break their tendons and bones from the impact, the soldiers on the horses were buried along with them. Some crashed headfirst into the surrounding rocks, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The strong inertia sent the riders flying, bleeding from the fall. There were even more warhorses that charged into Dongshuan's formation in a frenzy, kicking and biting, destroying with all their might until they fell under Dongshuan's sabers and swords. However, it was only these hundreds of frenzied warhorses that had caused thousands of Dongxian soldiers to be injured or killed. With a long neigh, the leader of Dongshuan's shadow cavalry charged over on a tall black horse, cursing loudly. Who asked them to tame these warhorses? Are they king courting death? They're already on the battlefield, and they don't even have this bit of common sense? A bunch of starts. The leader of the shadow cavalry roared like thunder. The most effective way to deal with the ownerless warhorses was to shoot them down with arrows. All other countermeasures were costly, and the loss outweighed the gain. A general came out from the army with a darkened expression and a saber in his hand, saying furiously, "Sacrificing yourself to show your loyalty? Your father is going to eat these beasts. All of you shall be crushed into pieces. Not even your bones will be left." The leader of the shadow cavalry was enraged, lashing the dark-faced general several feet away with a whip as he hollered, "How dare you? Such loyal warhorses, and you want to eat their flesh? Are you still human?" He was not willing to let it go after that, hopping off his horse and starting another round of frenzied beatings. There were tears glistening in his eyes. "Clean up these warhorses and bury them with all the Yutong soldiers who have died in the war." The leader of the shadow cavalry heaved a long sigh. There were still a few warhorses that were not dead yet, still twitching and whining on the ground. The desolation in their cries was heart-wrenching. The leader of the Black Knights sighed and walked over with large strides. He gently caressed the neck of the dying warhorse and softly comforted it. However, the steel blade in his hand was cleanly inserted into the warhorse's heart to send it off. "Go in peace. Your master is waiting for you underground. You can ride side by side again, never to be separated again." He stood up, still trembling with rage as he hollered, "Why doesn't anyone know about this military taboo? Why do they still want to violate it? Whose soldiers are these? Reply to your father." His angry roar echoed in the air, filled with grief and indignation. "Are you waiting for us to die, so that you can come and steal our loyal warhorses as well? Are you going to eat our loyal warhorses as well? Isn't that right?" The shadow cavalry and the steel cavalry were both lethal weapons on the battlefield. They were the continent's top cavalry. They had always regarded each other as their strongest opponent, and also their only opponent. At this moment, they could empathize with the fate of these masterless steel cavalry warhorses, as if they were experiencing it themselves. On Yutong's side, banners fluttered in the wind. Tens of thousands of soldiers saluted solemnly. Warhorses, the souls of their heroes remain. May they carry their masters to the afterlife, never to be separated again, to be together forever. The war between the two countries involved billions of people. Whether they were initially humble or arrogant, they could not escape from this whirlpool. Hidachui was the leader of the Raven Wind Gang. The Raven Wind Gang was a group of bandits that gathered in one place, roaming the eastern border all year round. Whether it was Dongxian or Yutong, as long as the Raven Wind Gang was wealthy, they would rob them. Although Hidachui was born in Yutong, he was the son of a mountain blacksmith. He was illiterate and did not know a single word. It could be said that he had no faith in his country or his people. After his father passed away, he relied on his superhuman strength to muddle through every day, robbing for a living. Slowly, he had become the leader of the bandits. Relying on their superior equipment, their 800 brothers were all skilled. They rarely made mistakes in trades that did not require capital, so their days were not bad. They could be said to be carefree. It was also because they did not care about nationality, did not care about right or wrong. They would not let go of any passing merchants or passers-by. That was why they were called the Eastern Borders Wolves. The citizens of both countries' borders hated this group of people, calling them wolf bandits. Hidachui had always been ashamed of the word wolf bandits. But because of the name, he had studied the wolf pack's tactics. Each time they made a move, they would swarm in like a gust of wind from all directions, and would disperse once they were done. They came and went like the wind, gathering and dispersing unpredictably, whether it was Dongxian or Yutong. They had long wanted to get rid of this group of people. Alas, both countries had tried to encircle him multiple times, but he had escaped deep into the mountains each time, returning empty-handed in the end. However, following this wave of war, the bandits' days were getting worse. Dongxian carried out the strategy of fortifying the walls and clearing the fields, slowly pushing forward. Along the way, all life was silent. On Yutong's side, they had built themselves into an impenetrable fortress, not budging an inch. Not even the slightest bit of human presence leaked out. The extreme confrontation between both sides had resulted in a very realistic outcome. Hidachui and his 800 bandits were slowly feeling that their livelihood was in question. If this went on, they would be in deep trouble. For the past few days, he had brought a few of his brothers to patrol the vicinity of the battlefield carefully. He hoped to find a chance to do some business and rob something. If this went on, it would be inevitable that they would run out of resources. The bandits moved like the wind and rarely stocked up on resources. During this period of time, the resources that they had accumulated previously had been depleted. Hidachui felt like his stomach was going to collapse from hunger. Chapter 457. When Yutong's 30,000 steel cavalry had gone to war, Hidachui had been sprawled in the snow like a lizard in the forest nearby, watching the battle with his mouth agape and eyes wide open. The brutality and heroism of the battle had shaken Hidachui's heart, shaking him to the core and shaking him to the core. What a good man! Since that day, Hidachui had been full of praises for Yutong's steel cavalry, yearning to be one of them. In fact, there were many times when Yutong's steel cavalry's earth-shattering roars would echo in his mind. In his dreams, Hidachui would even dream of becoming a member of Yutong's steel cavalry, galloping on the battlefield together, bathed in blood together, roaring to shake the heavens and frightening the enemy. Slowly, a strange thought grew in Hidachui's heart. It was yearning, passion, and a little narrow-mindedness. A sudden thought came to him. If I were to lead my men to help the army in war, would I be just as ferocious, never to return? At a time like this, it would not be a problem to seek for military merit, for one's birth, and for everything else in the past. If he were to become an official because of this, it would be even more wonderful. Of course, Hidachui would never say the same to his own brothers. Brothers, I have something to discuss with everyone. Now that the country is in trouble, we are bandits, but we are still from Yutong, after all. Now that our country is in trouble, we can't ignore it. I plan to help Marshal Fu the next time the two armies fight. Does anyone have any thoughts? If anyone disagrees, feel free to speak up. This is purely a matter of risking our lives. It's much more dangerous than what we've done in the past. Even I'm a little hesitant about it. I won't be offended if you speak up. The leaders looked at each other for a moment before someone spoke up. Big brother, it's understandable that you have such thoughts. This is how we live anyway. We've never done anything good for our country in our entire lives. Now that the country is in trouble, it's our duty to fight for our country. Even if we lose our lives here, our lives won't be in vain. It's better than being known as a bandit. Their thoughts were soon unified. After all, everyone knew their position in the eyes of the people. If they could get rid of their reputation as bandits, of course, they would be overjoyed, especially since they were confident in their abilities. They even felt that they might be able to defeat Yutong's steel cavalry if they were to fight one-on-one. They were confident that they could retreat unscathed, even if they were to fight. Hidachui felt a little guilty. After all, his wishful thinking was to use the lives of his brothers as gambling chips in exchange for wealth and glory. How could there be no deaths in war? However, He was more excited than anything else. In his opinion, a bright future was just around the corner. After witnessing a few small-scale battles with his own eyes, Hidachui came to a conclusion. Yutong's Steel Cavalry and Dongshuan's Shadow Cavalry did not have an advantage when compared to his wolf-taken. Many of their cultivation bases were weaker than his brothers. If their numbers were equal, his wolf-taken would definitely emerge victorious. It was not impossible for them to win the battle outright, or even win the battle outright. What kind of standard was that? What I need to do now is to wait for the right time. Once the battle begins, when both sides have similar numbers and are equally matched in combat power, the battle will definitely be in a stalemate. When that time comes, I'll join Yutong's side. It'll naturally be the last straw that breaks the camel's back. Not only can I help the army achieve victory easily, I can also use this to raise the wolf-taken's reputation. Who knows, I might even have a place in Yutong's military. If that's the case, then there's no need to take the risk. This is a great thing to do, a great thing to do. Hidachui made up his mind swiftly. For this reason, he even drank a few rounds of wine with his wolf-taken brothers, swiftly depleting the last of his reserves. Finally the day came. The opportunity that Hidachui had been waiting for had arrived. In fact, such opportunities were available every single day. Dongshuan's Shadow Cavalry had viewed the Shadow Cavalry's charge as a great humiliation. Since then, they had been fighting in front of the Fortress of Resilience every day, galloping like the wind on their steeds. All sorts of provocative actions were obvious. Yutong, on the other hand, had achieved a great victory, and their morale was at its peak. Despite Fu Baoguo's strict military orders, there were still times when they could not hold back. Fu Baoguo would send a troop of cavalry to deplete Dongshuan's Shadow Cavalry's combat power when they were showing off their strength. It would be a pleasant surprise if they could gain something from it. Therefore, after the battle that day, both sides would engage in a battle or two almost every day. The battlefield where both sides fought had already turned into crimson frozen blocks from the continuous battle, stained with fresh blood. On this day, the Shadow Cavalry's verbal abuse had crossed the Steel Cavalry's bottom line. Both troops of cavalry, each numbering over 10,000 men, had submitted letters of blood to request for battle. No matter how helpless Fu Baoguo was, he had finally lifted the ban and ordered Wang Dinghua to hold the line personally, fighting before the Fortress of Resilience. Against Dongshuan's Shadow Cavalry, 20,000 cavalrymen, the Shadow Cavalry and the Steel Cavalry, were the top cavalry troops in Tianxian continent, the only two elite cavalrymen in the world. All of them wore the same black helmets and armor as they fought, causing the ground to tremble. Fu Baoguo stood at the top of the fort, looking worried. To be fair, Fu Baoguo did not wish to fight this battle. Although Yutong's Steel Cavalry was not Fu Baoguo's trump card, it was one of his trump cards. In order to boost morale, he had only used this trump card after multiple arrangements. The outcome was just as Fu Baoguo had expected. They had achieved a complete victory. Not only had they destroyed the enemy's morale, they had also boosted their own side's morale to its peak. There were many benefits to a boost in morale, but there was no such thing as a boon without any drawbacks in this world. A boost in morale had its drawbacks as well. The drawback was that a bunch of proud soldiers and valiant generals were not easy to restrain. Now that they had won a great victory, they felt that they were the best in the world. Faced with the enemy's challenge and the loser's provocation, it was like a spark thrown into oil. It would explode at the slightest touch. There was no way to hold it back. If he were to forcefully suppress it, it would undoubtedly dispel his soldiers' enthusiasm. It would be even more inappropriate. Therefore, Fu Baoguo had lifted the ban despite knowing that this battle was not beneficial to the overall war, allowing the Steel Cavalry to fight the Shadow Cavalry. He only hoped that his side would have the morale of a great victory and would not suffer too much. Watching as both sides engaged in battle, Fu Baoguo recalled the mantra of every new and veteran soldier in the Fortress of Resilience. 30,000 soldiers can beat 300,000 soldiers without a temper. They're nothing. What are you shouting about? Do you really think we're afraid of them? Yutong's soldiers were unprecedentedly confident, not understanding their marshal's difficulties and schemes. If it had been in the past, Fu Baoguo would have had plenty of ways to suppress such emotions. Now, however, the war that concerned the fate of Yutong's nation was imminent. Fu Baoguo could only temporarily suppress such confidence of victory. How could he possibly suppress it? Such a situation had also led to one thing. They had to fight when the enemy came at them during this period of time. Otherwise, they would not be able to maintain and vent such high morale. They would deplete the overly high morale through battle, then use the sacrifice of their own soldiers to ignite their common hatred of the enemy. Such a battle was destined to be unavoidable. It was impossible to return to their previous defensive state. It was even more inadvisable. Watching the 20,000 cavalrymen fight with no regard for their own safety, Fu Baoguo's face was brimming with confidence, but his heart was filled with helplessness and bitterness. The 20,000 cavalrymen battle between Yutong's steel cavalry and Dongshuan's shadow cavalry was fought with the best of the best. They were all fighting with no regard for their own safety, in order to reclaim the title of the world's top cavalry. As far as the eye could see, everything within a 500-mile radius was the battlefield of this battle. Galloping hooves could be seen everywhere. The glint of swords and sabers could be seen everywhere. The steel cavalry's morale was obviously higher, but the shadow cavalry had also launched an extreme tactic of fighting with their lives on the line. On the battlefield, the clash of the two torrents did not slow down. Instead, it was picking up speed. It was as if heavenly lightning had ignited the fires of the earth as they collided with a loud bang. Both sides maintained their forward stance and did not retreat even half a step, not even the slightest bit. They allowed the flesh and blood on the ground to pile up layer after layer. In their eyes, there was only each other. As they broke through each other's formations, they whipped their horses around and launched another attack. Such an extreme battle was the dumbest tactic, but it was also the most passionate, the manliest tactic. Both sides were fighting with their lives on the line. The top of Yutong's fortress of resilience was cheering while Dongshuan's army was cheering as well. More than 1 million people were cheering at the same time, causing the battlefield to be a chaotic mess. Those who were involved in the battle could no longer hear what the people around them were shouting. They were only shouting at the top of their lungs. After today's battle, Yutong will still have the upper hand, and their morale will not falter. But this kind of depletion is too cruel. Fu Baoguo thought to himself, Dongxian has an abundance of soldiers, so of course they can afford it. On the other hand, even if we have the upper hand, we can't afford it. That's why we have to think of another way to reduce our energy consumption. We have to injure the other party while not injuring us. However, this is easier said than done. What kind of tactic should I use to hold Han Sanhe's 2 million troops back with the limited combat power we have? Fu Baoguo was still deep in thought when his gaze suddenly froze, looking in the direction of the faraway forest in disbelief. His mouth was agape, his jaw almost dislocated. What is that? In the dense forest, a troop of cavalry suddenly appeared. There were no more than 1,000 people at most. The entire troop rushed out like a sharp arrow towards the battlefield where the two sides were fighting. Dongxian did not move. Yutong did not move either. Where did this cavalry come from? What was his purpose for coming here? Was he friend or foe? First watch. Chapter 458. The troop's speed was incredibly fast as well, even surpassing Yutong's steel cavalry and Dongshuan's shadow cavalry in terms of speed. When the troop came closer, Fu Baoguo was even more shocked when he saw the other party's appearance. This group of people did not even have armor. They were only dressed in leather robes. They were oddly shaped, and some of them were even dressed in rags that barely covered their bodies. However, it was such a troop that had joined the battle in an unexpected manner, roaring and yelling. Their target was actually Dongshuan's shadow cavalry. What the F***ck is going on? Marshal Fu was genuinely confused. The two top-notch cavalry troops of the world were clashing against each other. Yet 1,000 bandits had joined the battle? Where did these fellows get their guts from? That action was clearly courting death? They are the wolf bandits. A deputy general beside him was also surprised. The wolf bandits have never cared about right or wrong. They don't care about identity or background. They rob whoever they see without exception. They are also the target that both our countries and our enemies want to eliminate. Why are they helping us fight this time? Moreover, they charged straight into the Black Knight's formation. This is simply courting death. Wolf bandits? They are the wolf bandits. Fu Baogua's mouth was agape. For a moment he did not know what to say. Fu Baogua had heard of this band of bandits that only existed in legends. But to him, they were nothing more than a minor nuisance that was not worthy of an army to annihilate. Thus he had let them be. There were only a few of them, so even if they committed a crime, they would not be able to cause too much of a commotion. When the battle ended, they could simply send an army to annihilate them. However, their actions now, even if they were to help Yutong's steel cavalry, was it not a little too strange? What was going on? Who could help me sort this out? Even if they are from Yutong and have the intention to serve the country, this is too impulsive, too thoughtless, too foolish. Fu Baogua murmured. Is the leader of the wolf bandits only a brute? Fu Baogua's guess was right. Hidachui was indeed a brute. He was illiterate, and the thing he did the most in his life was to be brave and ruthless. In the past he would listen to the wolf bandits' military advisor. However, this time, he believed in what he saw with his own eyes. He believed that his side's combat power was enough to lock down the battle. Only then did he enter the battle. If one had to say that something was strange, it would be the wolf bandit's military advisor. This person did not stop him from courting death, but instead followed him into the army formation. It was also because of this that Hidachui was certain that his decision was extremely wise and far-sighted. But at this moment Hidachui, who had just joined the battle, regretted it in less than 10 breaths. He regretted it so much that his intestines turned green. It turned out that watching from afar and personally participating in the battlefield were two completely different things. They weren't the same thing at all. The cultivation base of each of his brothers was indeed higher than that of any shadow cavalry or steel cavalry. Even in terms of individual movement speed, the wolf bandits had the upper hand. Even in terms of the explosive power of their horses, the wolf bandits were not at a disadvantage. All of these were correct. Hidachui did not see wrongly, nor did he make a wrong judgment. The only mistake in his judgment was that after they entered the battle formation, they suddenly realized that what they thought was just what they thought. It was all insignificant. Their higher cultivation base was at most just a fart. One-on-one, the wolf bandits were undeniably invincible against the shadow cavalry and steel cavalry. 3 against 3, the wolf bandits could still win completely. The shadow cavalry and steel cavalry could try their luck and join forces against one person. Perhaps they could take one person's life. If it was 10 against 10, the wolf bandits would still have the upper hand in the battle. There was a high chance that half of the wolf bandits would be killed, and the cavalry would be annihilated. However, when it came to a battle of 100 men, the wolf bandits would definitely lose. Their only chance of survival would be to escape using their movement speed that was faster than the two cavalries. As for the 1,000-man battle that Hidachui had imagined, there would indeed be a great victory, or even a complete victory. Yes, it would be one of the two cavalries who would win completely. The 1,000-man wolf bandits would not be able to escape the fate of being annihilated. As for the large-scale battle before him, the wolf bandits had no way of defending themselves. They could only be slaughtered. Yes, they could only be slaughtered. Hidachui had imagined that he would be able to create an imbalance in the battle formation with his first move, thereby achieving great feats. But that did not happen. The only thing he saw was, the moment his 800 brothers charged into the battle formation, in less than 10 breaths' time, 1/3 of them were gone. He blinked his eyes in disbelief. When he looked again, he realized that there were less than 200 survivors left on the Blue Island. This was too fast. They did not even have the chance to make a move. The moment they entered the battle, the enemy's weapons attacked them from all directions, and there was also a rain of arrows that rained down on them. The wolf bandits fell off their horses, and those who fell off their horses were immediately trampled into meat paste. The shadow cavalry did not suffer any losses. Hidachui felt as if he had been hit by a huge hammer, and he felt dizzy for a moment. At this moment, a wolf bandit who was dressed like a scholar rode a horse with a frail body. waving a long sword as he charged towards them. There were 3 other people beside him, guarding him as they charged towards him. They were the wolf bandits' military advisor and the other 3 leaders. They were the few with the highest cultivation base among the wolf bandits, aside from Hidachui. That was why they had managed to survive until now. However, by the time they reached Hidachui's side, there were only 2 of them left. One of them had his left shoulder sliced off, and it was unlikely that he would survive. "Big brother, let's go." The military advisor waved his sword, and sword light flashed, displaying an unusual power. The surrounding shadow cavalry could not stop him, but his face was abnormally red. It was obvious that he had used some kind of secret technique to activate his life force. Although he could show off for a while, it would not last long. When his life force was depleted, it would be the end of his life. "Big brother, hurry up and enter the pass," the military advisor shouted hoarsely. "With what happened today, the wolf bandits will be annihilated, and Big brother can expect to marry and have children in the future. Just don't forget to burn incense for us." Hidachui felt as if he had been struck by lightning, and his eyes widened. How did you know?" His heart was trembling. The plan in his heart. The military advisor smiled sadly. "We all know what Big brother is thinking, but the war between the 2 countries has begun, and the wolf bandits will be annihilated sooner or later. Even if they are not all killed, they will all starve to death. If we can use our lives to exchange for a golden path for Big brother, we are all willing." Hidachui's body swayed again, and he almost fell off his horse. He shouted frantically, "You all know this, and yet you still came to die." Before he could finish his sentence, he was at a loss and could not speak anymore. At the same time, a rain of arrows rained down, landing right where Hidachui was. Hidachui had lost his composure, and his heart was at a loss. He did not try to defend himself, and was about to become a porcupine or a porcupine. The absent-minded Hidachui suddenly felt his vision darken. It was the leader who had lost an arm, and he had thrown himself at Hidachui, blocking the rain of arrows for him. His whole body was immediately pricked like a porcupine, and his eyes were still fixed on Hidachui. "Big brother, run quickly. Our brothers are fighting with our lives. Just for Big brother's future. We're going to die anyway. Don't let us down." His voice stopped abruptly, and the leader's body trembled, and he fell off his horse. Only his eyes were still staring at Hidachui anxiously, but they gradually lost their spirit. However, countless cavalrymen came rumbling over, drowning his anxious gaze. Hidachui fought with all his might, and fought with all his might, just to see his brother one more time. However, after he survived the charge of the cavalrymen, all he could see was a pile of rotten flesh. Countless sabers, swords, spears, and arrows were still flying toward Hidachui without stopping. The Shadow Knights hated the horse bandits to the core. Hidachui's plan that day could be said to be one wrong move, and the whole game would be lost. However, there was one thing he was right about, and that was that their participation in the battle had ultimately affected the overall situation. Although the horse bandits were completely wiped out, it was like Hidachui's imagination, and they had successfully disrupted the formation of the Shadow Knights. The Steel Cavalry took this opportunity to massacre the horse bandits, and they already had a great advantage. They were about to turn this advantage into a victory and win. Both the Steel Cavalry and the Shadow Knights knew this was a foregone conclusion, and there was no turning back. It was only a matter of time. Therefore, the Shadow Knights naturally hated the horse bandits who had invaded without permission. They had to kill all the horse bandits before they were completely wiped out, or else how could they rest in peace? Especially the leader of the horse bandits before them. They would not rest until he was dead. The horse bandit advisor was still waving his sword with all his might, and he continued to use his remaining life force to protect Hidachui as they rushed out. Hidachui waved his hammers as tears streamed down his face. "That's what I planned. But I didn't expect everyone to die so tragically in this battle. I thought at least 80% of my brothers would follow me into the pass, and we would turn from bandits to soldiers together. But now, there were only 2 of us left." With a roar, the military advisor's eyes revealed a look of despair. A black spear ruthlessly pierced into the military advisor's stomach, and came out from his back. The advisor grabbed the spear with one hand and chopped off the head of the soldier with the black spear. Then, he stabbed the sword into the butt of Hidachui's warhorse and hissed, "Hurry up and go! Remember, don't act on your own in the future. Listen to orders in everything." Before the military counselor could finish his last sentence, a saber chopped his right hand. Then, 3 spears stabbed into his body at the same time. Chapter 459. However, the bandits' advisor's desperate efforts were effective. Hidachui's warhorse was stabbed by his sword, and it galloped away with an unprecedented burst of energy, actually escaping the battle. Hidachui tried desperately to rein in his warhorse, but to no avail. He could only let the tears in his eyes flow freely. Brothers. For the first time in his life, Hidachui understood the meaning of the word brothers. So this is what it means to be brothers. But when I understand it, I no longer have any brothers. The fortress of resilience was already in sight. Hidachui, who had yet to regain his composure, suddenly heard someone yell from the gate. "Open the gate, let him in." The thick gate opened abruptly. Hidachui's eyes were still streaming with tears. His tears had already turned red. They were tears of blood. At this moment, he deeply regretted his own selfishness. What future did he want? A bunch of brothers who had been living happily with him in the forest had died for him. The words of the military counselor and his brothers before they died flashed in his mind, like a bolt of lightning. "Big brother, in the future, you can have a wife and children. Don't forget to burn incense for us in the future. Big brother, the brothers know. We're going to die anyway. Let's use our lives in exchange for a golden path for Big brother. Everyone is willing." The third chief, who was riddled with arrows, said before he died, "Brothers, charge forward with our lives for Big brother's future. Go quickly." The military counselor roared before he died. "Go." Hidachui suddenly roared into the sky and wailed maniacally. "Enter the fort quickly. The gate will close if you don't enter now." Someone urged sternly. The fortress of resilience's gates could not be opened easily. If the Wolf-Taken had not joined the battle and secured the Steel Cavalry's victory, the gates would not have been opened so easily. However, Hidachui had yet to enter the fort, so the people inside were naturally anxious. They did not know that delays could lead to unforeseen changes. What if something unexpected happened? However, Hidachui still had not entered the pass despite the continuous urging from the other end. He suddenly turned his horse around and roared, "Brothers, when we reach the netherworld, we are still the Wolf-Taken. We come and go like the wind. We come and go without warning. I'm coming." Just as his 2 hammers smashed the heads of 2 cavalrymen, his entire body was pierced by more than 10 spears. Hidachui was bleeding from his 7 orifices. Suddenly he cracked his mouth and laughed. "I'm coming. I've never been so happy in my life." Hidachui was dead. All his life, he yearned to live in the light of day. All his life he hoped to get rid of the Wolf-Taken name and become a normal person. He wanted to become a person of status and bring honor to his ancestors. Yet when he saw hope, when hope was right in front of him and within reach, when the guards approved of him and allowed him to enter, he gave up. He gave up without hesitation. Once they entered the pass, they would no longer be Wolf-Taken. From now on, he was a military officer. As long as he didn't die, his future would be bright. But after all, he did not enter. No one knew what he was thinking. Moreover, no one knew what he meant when he said, "I've never been so happy in my life." Perhaps he finally understood what it meant to be a brother. Or perhaps, as a man of Yutong, he had finally fought for the country. In spite of this, his body was annihilated among the thousands of cavalrymen. No one cared about what he said anymore. The Wolf-Taken were annihilated. With Hidachui's death, the battle gradually came to an end. The battle between the 2 cavalrymen had ended. Yutong's Steel Cavalry was left with less than 3,000 men. Dongxuan's 10,000 Shadow Cavalry had been annihilated. Fu Baogua stood with his back straight. No one knew what he was thinking. Only Fu Baogua himself knew that he had suddenly understood something in that instant. "I know now. I know how to deal with Han Sanhe now. Even if this method can't guarantee victory, it can at least buy us some time. Hold on until the 9 Supremes Lords come to our aid," Fu Baogua said. We must find the wolf-taken leader's corpse later and bury him with military honors. This person has contributed greatly to this battle. He can't be buried, Fu Baogua said. Contributed greatly? Everyone was perplexed and unable to find an answer. In their eyes, the wolf-taken were a bunch of idiots who had come to die. How could they have contributed greatly? Could it be that the marshal was referring to them, using their lives to disrupt the Shadow Cavalry's formation? Contributed greatly from there? If that was the case, it would make sense. But Fu Baogua turned to walk back, ignoring the nagging of the generals beside him. Right now he felt as if he had been enlightened. I've been a marshal for so many years, my brain has actually become rigid. Fu Baogua thought to himself. It's this wolf-taken. That reminds me. Come and go like the wind, gather and disperse without warning. Swarm forward and scatter. Fu Baogua's eyes shone brighter. With the Steel Cavalry's strict discipline, and the wolf-taken's roguish fighting style, they can unleash a terrifying combat power. It still needs to be perfected. Gather and discuss the military situation. Yes, 4 days later, Han Sanha's million-strong army finally arrived. Yutong's warriors stood at the top of the Fortress of Resilience's wall. Looking into the distance, they could see densely packed military camps and tents, as far as their eyes could see. Flags fluttered in the wind as far as their eyes could see, covering the mountains and plains. Even when they tried their best, they could not see the end of it. It was a sea of people, a forest of camps. Dongshuan's reinforcements had arrived from the rear, boosting the morale that had been low. For a moment, the soldiers were strong and their horses were strong. They looked like they were going to conquer the Fortress of Resilience in one fell swoop. Teacher, I failed to live up to your expectations. Zhang Ge had come to ask for forgiveness. This was the first thing he said when he arrived at the central tent. Let's not talk about the fact that victory and defeat are common in a war. Let's talk about your defeat. Whether you lose to Tai Zhang or to Fu Baogua, it's not embarrassing. To you it's a valuable experience and a good thing. I've never expected you to defeat those famous generals in one battle. If you really win, it's delightful, but it might not be a good thing for your future. Han Sanha was unusually calm, as if he had already expected such an outcome. His words of comfort were sincere. The reason why Han Sanha had come so slowly was to prepare for the sudden arrival of the 9 Supremes. This was his top priority. He dared not delay or be negligent. On the other hand, it was as he had said. He wanted Zhang Ge to take charge of the situation and gain experience. He had never hoped that Zhang Ge could defeat Fu Baogua and occupy the Fortress of Resilience before his army arrived. How could the title of Yutong's strongest youth be obtained so easily? His words were hurtful, but they were the truth in Han Sanha's heart. Facing his beloved disciple, the person who would inherit everything from him in the future, he spoke his mind freely and went straight to the heart of the matter. Zhang Ge, you have to know that Yutong's military leaders, Xiao, Lung and Fang, are old now. The 2 main marshals of the army now are Tai Zhang and Fu Baogua. Facing Fu Baogua alone in such a battle is a rare experience for you. Han Sanha said in a low voice. Tai Zhang still has a weakness. Sometimes he relies on his martial prowess and sometimes he's reckless and reckless. However, Fu Baogua can be considered an all-rounder. He's experienced and prudent, rarely taking risks for luck. However, rarely taking risks doesn't mean that he can't. As long as the chance of victory is high enough, he won't hesitate when it's time to strike. The 30,000 Steel Cavalry's ambush is proof of this. This person is a difficult opponent. Han Sanha smiled faintly and said, however, all the famous generals in this world have their weaknesses. Fu Baogua is no exception. Perhaps I should say that his strength is also his weakness. He's too stable. Sometimes being too stable can become a weakness that can be exploited. Zhang Ge bowed to listen to his teacher's teachings. At this moment, he suddenly had the urge to ask, since all the generals in this world have their weaknesses, what is teacher's weakness? Indeed, what was the weakness of Han Sanha, the publicly acknowledged unrivaled general of this world? No one seemed to know yet. Perhaps it would be revealed in this battle? In the days that followed, both sides engaged in an even more intense battle than before. Han Sanha personally deployed his troops to attack the Fortress of Resilience. There were many battles in a row, the battles exceptionally brutal. Both the offensive and defensive sides were clear. Yutong defended while Dongxian attacked. Yutong's army, who relied on the fort, naturally had the upper hand. The casualty ratio between both sides was maintained at 4-1. This meant that Yutong had the advantage of the terrain. One person could take 4 lives from the opponent. In spite of this, Han Sanha did not mind. It was within his expectations. The Fortress of Resilience was the world's strongest fortress. It was easy to defend and difficult to attack. Furthermore, with Fu Baogua's steady management, the current situation was not unexpected. Furthermore, their military strength far surpassed Yutong's by a few times. Even if they were to expend their forces like this, they could still afford it. If they continued to attack like this, the enemy's morale would drop to rock bottom in at most 10 days. In 15 to 20 days, the Fortress of Resilience would fall. This was Han Sanha's confidence. He was certain that his judgment would not be wrong. Han Sanha had not planned to employ any other strategies or tactics right from the start. He would launch a direct attack and win with brute force. This was the most direct method that would result in the highest casualties, but it was also the most effective and targeted. It was especially effective against someone as stable as Fu Baogua. However, just like what Han Sanha had said himself, all the famous generals in this world had their weaknesses. Han Sanha was no exception. His weakness was perhaps his overconfidence. He had never expected that a person who had long hardened his character would undergo such a shocking transformation. As the saying went, a scholar who had been away for 3 days would be looked at in a different light. This time, the person Han Sanha had misjudged was Fu Baogua. He was shocked to realize that he did not seem to know Fu Baogua anymore. Chapter 460. To be more precise, Fu Baogua had changed. He was no longer the Fu Baogua of the past. Within Han Sanha's expectations, the only thing Fu Baogua should do when faced with Han Sanha's million-strong army was to defend with all his might and not lose. There was nothing else other than that. However, Fu Baogua's countermeasure was far more than that. The Fortress of Resilience had to be defended, impenetrable and as stable as a mountain. At the same time, however, Fu Baogua had also launched an action that was completely different from his usual marching style, a frenzied attack. Even Han Sanha found this method of attack troublesome. Fu Baogua's strategy was to deploy 100,000 steel cavalry. Indeed, 100,000 steel cavalry had been mobilized to shake Dongxian. Of course, these 100,000 steel cavalry were not going to attack Dongxuan's camp by force like the 30,000 steel cavalry had done previously. If they had done so, Han Sanha would have guffawed because it would not be a wise plan, but a suicidal move. The 100,000 steel cavalry had been divided into 20 teams by Fu Baogua and dispersed into the vast forest. Once the armies engaged in battle, or when Dongxuan's troops began to attack the city, they would be ambushed like a pack of wolves. These small groups of steel cavalry had truly accomplished these 16 words. They came and went like the wind, gathering and dispersing unpredictably. They swarmed forward and dispersed. This was the most orthodox way of fighting for the horse bandits. Now, after Fu Baogua had modified this tactic that had never been taken seriously by real cavalry, he had used the world's most elite steel cavalry to execute it. Whether it was day or night, as long as they saw an opportunity, they would appear and take a bite. They were well equipped and swift. After a single strike, whether it was a hit or not, they would flee far away, never lingering on the fight. It would be best if Dongxuan's troops, who had suffered the attack, chose to play it safe and not give chase. However, if they were bent on revenge and gave chase forcefully, not to mention whether they could catch up, who knew when another fresh troop would appear from another direction and leave immediately after the attack. If there were too many pursuers, they would inevitably be clumsy and unable to catch up. If there were too few of them, they might even be annihilated by the enemy. It would be wrong to pursue, but it was also wrong to not pursue. The steel cavalry, who had brought along sufficient rations, clean water and arrows, galloped on the battlefield in a pervasive manner. They were indescribably arrogant. In just a few short days, Dongxuan's supply line had been attacked 5 times. Every time, they would be attacked by a rain of rockets. Although the rations were not really intercepted, there were still some losses. The military camps at the borders of Dongxian would often catch on fire at night. Even if it did not turn into a huge fire, at the very least, the camp that was caught in the fire would not be able to avoid a night of no rest. Think about it, Dongxuan's troop had been fighting for a whole day. The men and horses were fatigued, and they had not slept for the whole night. How could they stand it? Even if the above did not harm his core, it was still a headache for Han Sanha. It was not that Han Sanha did not set up traps and ambushes to lure the steel cavalry into them. But for some reason, the soldiers did not fall for it at all, refusing to fall into the trap no matter what. It was as if they knew that the enemy camp that looked safe and could be taken down with a single strike was actually filled with endless ambushes and fatal traps. Faced with such a situation, even a veteran general like Han Sanha could not help feeling that Fu Baoguo must be King crazy. How could he be so ferocious? Was this still Fu Baoguo? Which god had awakened such a chakra for Fu Baoguo? Han Sanha's head was at least 2 times bigger than usual. 5,000 men a troop. Return to the city to resupply every 3 days. All movements are autonomous. There is only one goal, to weaken Dongxuan's combat power. Requirement. When moving at night, the hoofs of the horses must be wrapped in cotton wool to ensure that their movements are minimal. They are not allowed to advance recklessly. Requirement. In each battle, the casualties on our side must not exceed 10 men. Requirement. Only when the war horses have sped up can they attack. After the first strike, they must retreat immediately, no matter the outcome. Requirement. Do not engage in a head-on battle or force your way into the battle, no matter how good the opportunity is. Requirement. Only harass and weaken them. No annihilation is allowed. Even if they are facing a troop of 100 men, they must retreat immediately after the war horses have sped up and a volley of arrows. Requirement. Even if they see their comrades being ambushed in front of them and are about to be wiped out, those who are ambushed are not allowed to ask for help. Those who witnessed the ambush are not allowed to save them either. They must stay away at once. Then look for a chance to weaken the enemy. Requirement. Even if they only need to turn around and save their comrades from certain death, they are not allowed to turn around. Requirement. Even if they see the fortress of resilience being breached, they are not allowed to provide aid. Requirement. Every person must bring back a piece of nightmare stone and a piece of rolling log during every resupply, in exchange for supplies and arrows. Every time there is a resupply, if more than 50 men are killed within 3 days, the leading general will be beheaded. The assistant general will be beheaded. Disband the troops and rebuild after disruption. For those who violate the above requirements, the leading general will be beheaded, and the assistant general will be beheaded. Disband the troops and rebuild after disruption. This was Fu Baoguo's request when the steel cavalry moved out. It was a temporary battlefield discipline. His orders were strictly enforced, and his words were the law, eliminating all hidden dangers before they could occur. The steel cavalry's wolf pack tactic was effective, giving Han Sanha a headache. However, it was only a minor detail, and did not affect the overall situation much. The key to the war was still the fortress of resilience's success and failure. The war between both sides was getting more and more intense. As the days passed, the fortress of resilience seemed to be teetering on the brink of collapse, but it held on each and every day. Another siege battle ended. Fu Baoguo stood at the top of the fort as usual, watching his assistant generals anxiously commanding the repair of the fort wall, moving supplies and transporting wounded soldiers, but he did not budge. The general was the soldier's courage, the marshal was the army's soul. Although Fu Baoguo did not do anything, as long as he stood there steadily, Yutong's army would have a backbone. Fu Baoguo had not slept for 3 days and 3 nights, but he still looked full of energy and vigor. He gave others boundless confidence. With Marshal Fu here, the fortress of resilience was Yutong's. No one could take it away. Not even Han Sanha could do it. Fu Baoguo stood at the top steadily, his gaze fixed on the white clouds in the sky. There was only one thing on his mind now, I've used all my trump cards and exerted all my strength. I'm afraid I can't hold on much longer. Yutong has almost 10,000 casualties every day. This loss of combat power isn't something that can be compensated with fighting spirit and morale. 9 Supremes Lords, the only hope of this war lies on you. You. When will you be able to come? I hope to see you one last time. To tell you that you weren't wrong that day. Fu Baogua is no longer that selfish, despicable man. Report. Speak. Marshal, the fort's repair is complete. Good. Everyone, rest on the spot and recover your stamina as much as possible. Yes. Looking at the exhausted warriors resting, Fu Baogua stood up straight and suddenly guffawed. Brothers, do you know what this marshal is thinking now? A deputy general chimed in. May I ask what the marshal is thinking? Fu Baogua guffawed and said, I'm thinking that Han Sanha is known as the god of war, the top general acknowledged by the world. His military force is a few times more than ours, but there's still no progress after such a long time. We've always been as steady as a mountain, unshakable. Say, don't you think this god of war doesn't live up to his name? Fu Baogua said loudly. Ha 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 ha. The warriors guffawed, inexplicably feeling that the other side's million-strong army was led by the god of war himself to attack the fortress of resilience. They had so many advantages, but they still couldn't take it down after such a long time. It's hard to live up to his reputation. Right now, I truly feel embarrassed for Han Sanha. Think about it. How long has it been since I've been on the battlefield? My personal combat power is only SOSO, but Han Sanha can't do anything to me. Doesn't this already speak volumes? Fu Baogua's laughter boomed like thunder. To raise morale, Fu Baogua had resorted to every conceivable means, even resorting to self-destructive tactics. However, the effect was obvious. Everyone's ears were filled with cheers. Even the exhausted soldiers felt a wave of pride and could not help puffing out their chests. Of course, no one would take Fu Baogua's personal combat power seriously. Come to think of it, it's not a shame that Han Sanha couldn't take down the fortress of resilience. At least, I think it's within reason. Fu Baogua's eyes gleamed coldly. After all, it's I, Fu Baogua, who's guarding this place. With me, Fu Baogua, here, what can 10 gods of war do to me, let alone one Han Sanha? Fu Baogua's voice was like thunder, deafening to the ears. Marshal, mighty, countless Yutong warriors roared, their blood boiling. No one thought that Fu Baogua's words were incoherent or contradictory. After all, everyone knew, especially the veterans, that perhaps Marshal Fu was the top man in Yutong's military today. He might not just be the best of the younger generation. Fu Baogua guffawed at the sky, looking proud and confident that the world was within his grasp. In spite of this, he was calling out anxiously in his heart. Lord Supreme Wind, when can you come? The Empire of Yutong, Tiantang City. Qiu Jianhan had not slept or rested for the past few days. He was busy reorganizing the new troops, allocating resources, and sending reinforcements. All sorts of matters, big or small, had to go through his hands before he could be at ease. He dared not slack or be negligent. Actually, it was not only Marshal Qiu. The entire imperial court of Yutong's imperial court was swamped with work. Even when His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu were free, they could only frown, unable to express their emotions. Chapter 461. The order of the previous chapter was wrong. It should have been 157, but the editor had gone to sleep. This one was 158 according to the normal order. His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu asked each other several times a day. The old Marshal and His Majesty were well aware of the fact that Supreme Wind was actually Supreme Cloud all along. The original Supreme Wind would never have been able to do what he was doing now. Only Supreme Cloud, the 9 Supremes think tank, would have had such a plan and could see the bigger picture. However, since Supreme Cloud did not show his true face and used the identity of Supreme Wind as a disguise, there must be a deeper meaning to it. Yutong naturally had to help him conceal it. However, the whole world might already know that the Supreme Wind, who had reappeared, was actually Supreme Cloud. From now on, there was no need to hide it anymore. Some time ago, Yutong's higher-ups had received news that the Empire of Zio had set up layers of stratagems to trap Supreme Cloud. When he received the news, His Majesty had almost fallen ill from anxiety. Fortunately, news came right after that. Supreme Cloud had wreaked havoc in Zilong City, fought a bloody battle with the army, broke through the siege, and retreated unscathed. He had even triggered the Lunar River's waters to flood the Empire of Zio in front of Zilong City, threatening to force Zio's emperor and others to submit. His prowess had shocked the world. He had even brought back the remains of the Shangguan family of generals General Shangguan Wudi, allowing the family's heroic spirit to return. This news was like a soothing pill to the Yutong emperor, who had been impatient at the time. He was beaming with joy, as if an acute illness had been cured in an instant. Furthermore, the Empire of Zio had retreated because of this incident, breaking away from the four-nation alliance. This had greatly reduced the pressure on Yutong's front line. After confirming the situation, the order was immediately passed. Half of the western garrison was sent to reinforce the eastern defense, to fend off the powerful enemy, Dongxian, and to deal with Han Sanhe together. A few days later, news of Lord Supreme Cloud reinforcing the southern front line and displaying his prowess in the southern border battlefield, repelling De Yuan's army in one fell swoop, and stabilizing the southern border's defense was heard again. Yutong was filled with thunderous cheers, the people's hearts surging. The 9 Supremes were the 9 Supremes. Even if there was only one of them left, he would still be Yutong's guardian angel. With the 9 Supremes, Yutong had no worries. After Supreme Cloud had ended the southern border war, he had told the southern marshal that he would immediately depart for the eastern defense. This had relieved Yutong's emperor and the officials in the imperial court. With Supreme Cloud's assistance, even if the eastern defense could not counterattack, they would at least be safe. Who knew from then on? There was no more information about Supreme Cloud. Supreme Cloud seemed to have vanished just like that. It was as if it had really turned into a cloud midway and didn't move at all. 20 days had passed since then. It would take at most a few more days for the troops that the Western Army had transferred to the east to reach the Fortress of Resilience. Lord Supreme Cloud, who had left earlier and possessed unparalleled speed, had not shown up at the eastern line. Not only was it strange, but it was also a bad omen. The battle in the east was in full swing, and it was so tragic that the land was red for tens of thousands of miles. However, Supreme Cloud was nowhere to be found. What's going on? How could there be no news at all? Even Zilong City's spiritual restraining formation is helpless against Supreme Cloud. What force in this world can keep him in check? Qiu Jianhan paced back and forth in the hall of the Board of War anxiously. On the other side, His Majesty was also pacing back and forth like an irascible lion. What happened? His Majesty's brows were knitted together. In these few days, there were even people who had begun to attack Supreme Cloud, saying that if Supreme Cloud had not been so stubborn and left Yutong for Zio, such a thing would not have happened. This was obviously a trap, but he had still jumped into it. He was obviously ignoring the nation's crisis. He was inhumane. Not only old Marshal Qiu, even His Majesty was infuriated by such remarks. Must one remain indifferent for the sake of the nation when their relatives and friends are kidnapped? Could it be that they have a heart of stone? What's more, it was still the period of the letter of credence. All the countries agreed that there would be no war before the new year. Such a letter of credence was announced to the entire Tianxian continent. Who would have thought that the 4 countries would tear it apart at the same time? What's more, it's the middle of winter when the snow has sealed off the mountains and roads. It's always been the time for the militarists to recuperate. Who would have thought that the war would come at this time? In spite of this, His Majesty heaved a long sigh in the end. He really had not expected it. Even he, Qiu Jianhan, Leng Daoyin, and the others had never thought that the letter of credence would be broken. This was a letter of credence that was witnessed by heaven's will. A letter of credence that was connected to the continent's providence. Did those monarchs not want to live anymore? Heavy panting could be heard as a soft bag was carried in. On it, old Grand Commandant Fang Qingtian lifted half of his body anxiously. Is there any news of Supreme Cloud? His eyes were filled with fervent anticipation. The old Grand Commandant, who was like a candle in the wind, was still worried, and had ordered someone to carry him over. Qiu Jianhan shook his head silently. Disappointment and dejection flashed across the old Grand Commandant's eyes. He murmured, "Although no news is good news, I still want to know Supreme Cloud's whereabouts now. As long as this old man knows news of Lord Supreme Cloud, even if it's not news of him rushing to the battlefield, this old man can die in peace even if I close my eyes now." His Majesty the Emperor's gaze was cold. "Old Qiu, Supreme Cloud went missing on his way from the southern border to Dongxian this time. It's a mountain range that stretches for tens of thousands of miles. To be able to trap Supreme Cloud there." A murderous glint flashed across Qiu Jianhan's eyes. "It can only be the Four Seasons Tower. It must be them. Only the Four Seasons Tower could send such an earth-shattering expert to trap Supreme Cloud now. Now we can be sure that something must have happened to Supreme Cloud. He must be fighting the Four Seasons Tower's experts now. It's just that we don't know if Supreme Cloud is only trapped, or if his life is at risk." Qiu Jianhan's eyes were filled with worry. He did not want to say the last part. "But where were you, Supreme Cloud?" Critical military news. Lung Doing charged in. "Dongxian has sent another 800,000 soldiers. They've been deployed in batches. The first batch of 300,000 is already on its way. The second batch has been assembled, and the third batch is being assembled. Has Han Sanhe gone mad? This is already the scale of a nation's destruction. If Dongxian doesn't fall in this war, it'll be the end of Yutong's reign." His Majesty and old Marshal Qiu's expressions changed at once. Even if Fu Baoguo's subordinates were to include the reinforcements he had sent out during this period of time, and the martial artists who had volunteered themselves, there were only less than 500,000 men left. Even if half of the western border's military force had arrived, there would only be 150,000 men as reinforcements. To fight against 2,200,000 men, with less than 650,000 men? Just this pressure was enough to make anyone go crazy from the pressure. Fu Baoguo was human as well. Could he be an exception? Lung Daoyin said loudly, "Your Majesty, the new troops are about to complete their training." This old official requests for permission to head to the Eastern Defense and assist Fu Baoguo in defending the Fortress of Resilience. His Majesty the Emperor mused. The current situation was obvious. Fu Baoguo alone would not be able to hold the fort. A person's energy was limited. He would die of exhaustion. The enemy could rest in shifts, but there was only one pillar of support for the Fortress of Resilience. Fu Baoguo could not rest. Once the enemy's reinforcements arrived, it would be the time Fu Baoguo's life would end. It was necessary to send men and reinforcements. Under such circumstances, the military's general had to rush over to assist. In addition, this candidate's capability and reputation could not be lower than Fu Baoguo's. These two men were the Empire of Yutong's military stabilizing force. Once they went to the eastern border, they would be a great boost of morale. His Majesty the Emperor was about to agree to it. "Wait!" Qiu Jianhan's white beard fluttered as he spoke in a low voice. "It's most suitable for me to go to the Eastern Defense." Lung Doyin retorted angrily. "Am I not suitable?" Qiu Jianhan said. "Old Lung, we know ourselves best. I've been stationed at the Eastern Defense for 20 years. I can almost remember every blade of grass and tree there. You've always roamed the south and the west. How can you be more familiar with the eastern border than I am? Tell me who's more suitable to go. Moreover, although I've been in the capital city all these years, I'm confident that my prestige at the eastern border is still there. It's as solid as a rock, indestructible. If I don't use it now, what am I waiting for? I'll let you say who's more suitable for the eastern border." Qiu Jianhan was merciless, his words unusually straightforward. Lung Daoyin's face flushed red, but he compromised and said, "What you've said is reasonable, but an old man can't rely on his bones. Let me go." "Old Qiu, you're older than me after all." He looked at Qiu Jianhan worriedly. Everyone knew that Qiu Jianhan was indeed the most suitable person to go to the eastern border. However, looking at his head full of white hair, how could he bear to let the old general put on his armor and embark on his journey again? Especially when he was facing Han Sanhe, His military strength and combat power were both inferior. Qiu Jianhan said sternly, "Can't I kill Han Sanha just because I'm older?" He turned around and said, "Your Majesty, this old official requests your command. Tomorrow morning, I shall lead 200,000 men to the east." His Majesty looked deeply at his old comrade, his brother. He took a deep breath and finally said, "Good. Marshal Qiu shall go in this battle. But it's not 200,000 men. I'll gather another 100,000 men from the palace guards and the royal guards for you. If the border is unlucky, what's the use of the palace guards even if the royal guards are left?" Very well. The plan was finalized. Your Majesty, if there's a day when you hear of this old official's defeat, Qiu Jianhan sucked in a deep breath and said, "Please move the capital to the southern border immediately to preserve Yutong's vitality." His Majesty turned away, not saying a word. After a long while he said, "No need to say anything more. Yutong shall not perish." Lung Doyin came over hurriedly and said, "Old Qiu." He choked on his words and said after a long while, "Take care." Qiu Jianhan laughed boldly and said, "If Dongxian doesn't retreat, this old man's old bones will truly be handed over to Han Sanha." Saying that, he turned and strode away. That night, all the families in the country petitioned to join the war. Even the Shengguan family of generals was among them. The Lung family and the Qiu family came out in full force. Even the women with cultivation base mounted their horses, ready to depart. Shengguan Lingxiu had just returned and had requested to join the war immediately after asking for it, even gathering all of the Shengguan family's military force. 20,000 warriors who had been through hundreds of battles were ready to fight. In spite of this, the hearts of everyone in the empire of Yutong were heavy. The danger of this war had never been seen before. The eastern border was in a state of emergency. Dongxian had mustered the military force of a nation, gathering 2 million soldiers, a scale that could destroy a country. They even had a god of war, the world's top general, as their marshal. The entire Yutong was immersed in the atmosphere of an impending storm. Everyone was calling out anxiously in their hearts, "Supreme Cloud, where are you? I'm begging for monthly votes." Chapter 462. It was early in the morning on the day of the expedition. Shengguan Lingxiu could not help but make a trip to the residence of Heavenly Clouds. The residence of Heavenly Clouds had been completely rebuilt. Its size was almost twice as big as before. It was even more luxurious and high profile. The white jade capital in the heavens and the residence of Heavenly Clouds in the mortal realm. The difference was comparable to that of a real estate. It looked magnificent, and one would like it from the bottom of one's heart. However, such a stunning residence seemed empty and devoid of any signs of life. After the new residence was completed, Dong Tianling, Chun Wanfeng, and the others each occupied a side yard, shamelessly making it their own home. Yun Yang had not returned, and the owner was not around. Lao Mei would not chase the young master's guests away, so he could only allow the 4 fellows to stay. After the previous battle, Lao Mei had a whole new level of respect for Dong Tianling and the other 3 fellows. His attitude towards them was vastly different as well. If it was said that he was only concerned about his reputation and acting to keep up appearances before, he was now really treating the 4 of them like family and friends. The friendship that had been forged after going through a war together, a battle of life and death, was indeed extraordinary. If someone had told Lao Mei that he could become a true friend of the legendary spring, summer, autumn, and winter young masters, and that they would never abandon each other in life or death, Lao Mei would have spat on that person's face. Now he could only swallow his spit. The world was truly unpredictable. Most righteous people were those who butchered dogs, while most heartless people were scholars. This was indeed a well-known saying. However, the 4 popinjays were not those who butchered dogs either. Why were they so affectionate? How could Lao Mei justify his words? It's so comfortable. This residence, King Hell. When your father lives alone after splitting from the family, I'll get a house like this. This is the perfect life. Dong Tianling shook his legs in satisfaction. The few remaining guards of the Dong family looked up at the sky. King Hell. This fellow was actually thinking of splitting from the family now. If the head of the family knew about this, all 3 of his legs would probably be broken. Also, even if you did split from the family, you wouldn't be able to afford a house like this. Just looking at the building materials alone, a side yard like this would definitely cost at least 30 to 50 million silver taels. Even if you emptied your family's assets to buy it, wouldn't you be able to live in the future? What's more, it's a waste for you to live in such a good house. Can you keep it? Maybe one day, there would be a high-level cultivator who coveted such a good man-made cultivation place and directly snatched it. This was all expected and reasonable. The 4 of them led a befuddled and carefree life in the residence of Yin with their guards. However, it had only been 4 days. They had probably just warmed up from sitting, but had not even warmed up from their sleep, when they were all grabbed by Qiu Jianhan. "You brats, follow me to war. Look at your fat and lazy bodies. I have to train for your father, or else I'll have to do it in the future." The old marshal's eyes were bloodshot as he plotted for the sake of the empire of Yutong's safety. He suddenly remembered that his nephew seemed to be in the capital. Moreover, that brat had a few playboy friends by his side. Moreover, there were quite a few fellows with high cultivations by their side. If he didn't capture them and use them, he would be going against his conscience. Naturally, he found a random reason to capture them all and enlisted them in the army. Although Dong Tianling and the other 3 fellows were reluctant, none of them dared to provoke him. Who was this old Marshal Qiu in front of them? He was someone that even Boss Yin had to be submissive to, the leader of Yutong's 3 infamous rogues. Since the old man had spoken, it was better for the few of them, who were merely small fries, to follow his orders. "Let me tell you, it's wartime now and Yutong is in danger. Do whatever you want. If you don't obey, you'll be punished according to military law." The old marshal glared. "What do you mean by military law? How is it military law?" Chen Wanfeng blinked his eyes in confusion. "We didn't say that we won't go. But what do you mean by military law?" "Military law means beheading. Simply put, beheading if you don't obey." Qiu Jianhong glared at them. When the 4 of them heard this, they were all shocked. F***ck, they were really playing with their lives. They immediately thought of retreating. No, we're not going, we're not soldiers, we sob. Change their clothes and take them all away. At Qiu Jianhan's command, a group of people charged in with menacing smiles and stripped the 4 fellows naked. Then, they put on a military uniform for each of them. "Now that you've put on your uniforms, it's all over. You're all soldiers now." The old marshal was unreasonable. "Of course, we have to be punished according to military law, if we're soldiers." The 4 of them looked like they were about to cry. F***ck, how could there be such a thing in this world? I've only heard of people being forced into prostitution, but now this is forcing people to enlist? This is forcing people to enlist in the army. Dong Tianling twisted his neck. "Old Master Qiu, can you be more reasonable? I'm not a member of the Qiu family. You can't control me. How dare you talk back to your superior? Do you know that this is a crime punishable by death? Since it's your first offense, I'll give you a light punishment. Men 10,000 military flogs." Dong Tianling was terrified. F***ck, 10,000 military flogs? And this was just a light punishment. After that, there wasn't even a piece of flesh the size of a fingernail left on my body. He had truly experienced the true colors of a gangster now. The legendary leader of Yutong's 3 biggest gangsters lived up to his name indeed. He was a real gangster. In comparison, their titles as the 4 popinjays were at most child's play. There was no comparison. The difference was like heaven and earth. "Spare my life. This subordinate is willing to serve the country loyally, even if I have to die 1,000 times." Dong Tianling admitted defeat. "At least you know what's good for you. You lot don't know what's good for you. This old man is kind enough to give you an official position. Your ancestors should thank this old man. Thank my 18 generations of ancestors. Let's go." Qiu Jianhan dragged Dong Tianling away by his ears. The other 3 men were escorted to enlist in the army as well, cursing Qiu Jianhan's entire family, and even his 18 generations of ancestors along the way. An official position? Who the F***ck cares about it? Look at how benevolent and righteous you are. If my family were to find out about this, they would definitely beat you to death, you old fart. Forget about scolding your ancestors. The Chiu clan will never agree to it. Cursing was one thing. But it was clear that the situation was against them. The four of them could only submit to it. How did the saying go? Life was like being strengthened. One could only choose to enjoy it if one could not fight back. These four men were captured, while their guards could only follow them passively even if they were not captured. This was the inevitable outcome of a certain gangster's calculation. A bunch of peak realm cultivators would be a waste if they were left alone. It was only right to make use of them all. Thus, the residence of Yun was empty once again. Feng Mafei and Bai Yixue discussed with Lao Mei and followed Qiu Jianhan directly. Young master's lifelong wish is to protect Yutong. We're his guards, of course we have to go to the battlefield. Although we can't charge with the army, it's our duty to be old Marshal's personal guards and protect his safety. These were their heartfelt words, and they told old Marshal Qiu as well, expressing their willingness to be old Marshal Qiu's personal guards for a period of time to come. Old Marshal Qiu was almost overjoyed that these two had come to help him. Old Marshal Qiu's understanding of a surmounting cultivator's power was relatively limited, but he knew that both of them were superb cultivators above 10th perfection, especially Bai Yixue, who was one of the world's top swordsmen. It was only natural that he was delighted to be able to survive the sword of the unrivaled sword lord, Mo Yen. Although the evaluation of Bai Yixue was a little low, and a little too high, it was still acceptable. Both of them were delighted. Actually, Lao Mei wanted to go as well. However, the residence of Yun needed someone to watch over it no matter how big it was. Therefore Lao Mei stayed. Then, Lao Mei realized that he had returned to the state he was in a few years ago. The entire residence of Yun, the vast residence of heavenly clouds, that was supposed to be the best place for cultivation, only had himself as the caretaker. Apart from that, there was no one else. The sudden silence made Lao Mei feel even more lonely. It was so lonely. Seeing Shangguan Lingxiu visit, Lao Mei was even a little surprised. There was finally someone to talk to, was there not? Any news from young Master Yin? Shangguan Lingxiu asked. No. Lao Mei sighed. Yin Yang was different from Supreme Cloud. There were not many who would specifically ask about him at this juncture. After all, the title of Tiantong's top popinjay was still on someone's head. It was not a big deal for him to suddenly disappear for 10 days, or even half a month. Unexpectedly, Shangguan Lingxiu, who heard the reply, turned to leave without hesitation. She left cleanly, without hesitation. Lao Mei was taken aback. What did she mean? He could clearly see the anxiety and worry in Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes. However, is that all you've said when you came? I haven't even opened my mouth yet. Can you give me some space to relieve my loneliness? No, Shangguan Lingxiu did not have the time now. Since there was still no news from the only person who might know Supreme Cloud's whereabouts in this world, it was better to prioritize national affairs and rush to the front line. In spite of it, Shangguan Lingxiu's trip was not entirely fruitless. She had gained 2 new soldiers under her. Both of them were slender and had long hair that cascaded down like a waterfall. Their silhouettes were beautiful and tempting. However, when one looked at their dark and misty faces, other than making one feel that they needed to be vigilant and ready to defend themselves at any time, there was only pity. Was it because the heavens were jealous of beauty and did not allow the world to have beautiful ladies? These 2 ladies were, of course, Jilingxi and Yurulan. The 2 ladies were considered completely safe during this period of time. It was unknown why the Four Seasons Tower's manpower had suddenly retreated. Lei Dongtian had already disappeared without a trace. The people from the 2 noble families had come a few times to search for the 2 ladies. They were anxious as well. They had accepted the betrothal gifts, but their daughters had suddenly gone missing. This matter had to be found. They had considered whether they should look for trouble with Lei Dongtian. After all, it was Lei Dongtian's strange way of courting that had caused them to run away. However, they had not made up their minds yet. After all, the 2 families would have to think long and hard before they could make a decision to offend someone like Lei Dongtian. In addition, this decision might turn out to be a cowardly one. However, Their search was also aimless. After all, like Lei Dongtian, they knew that this place was the only place that Yi Lingxi was connected to. However, with the Nine Heavens dictum and the two ladies' disguises, the other party could not recognize them even if they were face to face. They could only scurry around like headless flies. It was one thing for the two ladies to be safe, but it was another for Shui Wuyin to be tormented. Shui Wuyin had been feeling like his days were dark and gloomy. Every day he saw Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan. It was as if he had seen the king of hell. Where did Yin Yang go? What is this place? Why is this happening? Lock us up. What do you mean? Speak clearly. Why aren't you speaking, coffin face? Say something. I remember that you can speak. Speak quickly. Shui Wuyin had to be interrogated more than 30 times a day. Shui Wuyin was miserable. Yet, he could not afford to offend either one of them. This was the most torturous thing. One was the sister of Supreme Wind, whom Shui Wuyin respected the most in his life. The other was Supreme Wind's fiancée. Shui Wuyin wished that he could worship these two people like deities. How would he dare offend them? These were the relatives of the god in his heart. Two goddesses. In the end, Shui Wuyin finally confessed, speaking vaguely about some information. Actually, I'm doing this to protect the both of you. I know that the both of you are uncomfortable, but it's too dangerous out there. If you act rashly, you'll be putting yourselves in danger. Actually, the both of you are Supreme Wind's fiancée and sister of Yutong's 9 Supremes. Towards the end, Shui Wuyin spoke vaguely of the news. It was as if the two ladies had heard a bolt from the blue. This heavy news made the two women dizzy, and their eyes and mouths almost became crooked. It was no wonder that they could not find their brother and fiancé. So this was the truth. However, wasn't this information a little too shocking? Their eldest brother, their fiancé, how did he become Supreme Wind? So brother is carrying such a heavy responsibility. If it was someone else, he would have been crushed to death. Ji Lingxi thought. So, he carries such a deep grudge with him. Yes. How could he only care about marrying me under such circumstances? He would feel sorry for his brothers as well. Yu Rulan thought to herself. After thinking that they understood their brother's, sweetheart's, predicament, Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan made a decision at the same time. Since Ji Lingfeng cared so much about the empire of Yutong, and had dedicated his life to the country, to the 9 Supremes' brothers, now that Yutong was in trouble and Supreme Wind was not around, the responsibility that belonged to him was also their responsibility. Of course, they had to shoulder it. Since he's not here, we'll help him protect the country. Shui Wuyin had never thought that his words would make these two ladies want to join the army and serve the country. He tried his best to persuade her, but to no avail. The two ladies were resolute. Who could control these two ladies when Yin Yang was not here? Shui Wuyin could only think of a way to contact the Shengguan family of generals. Everyone knew that Shengguan Lingxiu was going to war. Only by following a female general would they feel more at ease. Old Mistress Shengguan was still fretting that Shengguan Lingxiu's personal guard's cultivation base was too low, and that they might not be able to protect her granddaughter's safety on the battlefield. Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi's cultivation base was not worth mentioning in the eyes of experts, but in the Tianxian continent, they were considered top-notch. So he immediately agreed. That very morning, banners fluttered in the wind as the army set out. When Qiu Jianhan led the army out of Tiantang City's east gate, he could clearly feel the worried gaze of his old wife, who had been by his side all his life watching him from the wall behind him. Qiu Jianhan steeled his heart and refused to turn back. The army was neat, mighty, and majestic. In spite of this, Qiu Jianhan found it odd. In his entire life, he had led an army into battle no less than 100 times. But this was the first time he had such a strange feeling. He didn't have the confidence he had in the past. It was snowing heavily. Qiu Jianhan howled. Yutong is forever. 666 war drums and 666 trombones sounded at the same time. Qiu Jianhan laughed at the sky and rode away. His white beard fluttered in the wind and snow as his hearty laughter came from afar. This old man has gone to war hundreds and thousands of times in his life, but going to war in the snow is a different kind of feeling. Ha ha ha. Qiu Jianhan leading the army, be it the veterans or the new recruits, was elated. Han Sanha was the god of war. But Qiu Jianhan was also the Empire of Yutong's invincible idol. The old marshal had not led an army into battle for more than a decade. Everyone was equally excited to see him go to war today. On top of the city wall, old Mistress Qiu lowered her gaze sadly. Old Mistress Qiu was inexplicably worried. Looking at her husband's majestic back as he walked further and further away in the snow, she could not help the tears welling in her eyes. It was as if the most important thing in her life had suddenly been lost. Her heart was filled with worry, an urge to follow the army into battle. They would be together in life, and they would be together in death. In her palm was the letter her husband had left behind. It was a thick stack, but old mistress did not read it. She knew what was written in it. She would rather not open this letter for the rest of her life, until the day she died. When her husband came home last night and told her that he was going to war, she was visibly stunned. It was because the tiger-hoofed hurricane that had followed her husband for 17 years had suddenly fallen ill and died just yesterday morning. Her husband had 2 fine horses in his lifetime. When he was young, he had tamed the king of horses in the grassland, the tiger-hoofed hurricane. Since then, he had never tasted defeat in the battlefield. Many years later, the old horse had retired, and the one he rode was the offspring of the tiger-hoofed hurricane. Now the second horse had died of illness as well. What a coincidence! It had died a day before her husband went to war. Old Mistress Qiu had a bad feeling about this. When her husband came home and received the news, he was silent for a long time. Then he dug a big hole with his physical strength and buried the horse. Then, he held the wine pot and drank on the grave for half the night. Only then did he go to war. Just when she was sending her husband out in the wee hours of the morning, a sudden gust of wind blew, and a brick fell from the gate and landed in front of her husband. Old Mistress Qiu had wanted to persuade her husband not to go to war this time. However, Qiu Jianhan had only glanced at the brick in front of him in silence before he left resolutely. He had said nothing. Old Mistress Qiu shuddered at the thought of it. However, there was no other way around it. It was the duty of a general to fight on the battlefield when the empire was in danger. How could he retreat just because of some strange little things before the war? The army had decided to go. How could he not go at this time? Come back soon. Old Mistress Qiu's voice echoed in the snow. She spoke with utmost sincerity. Heaven, as long as old Qiu can return safely, I am willing to be a vegetarian for the rest of my life, to sink into the abyss of misery in my next life, in exchange for the last few years of this life. Heaven, please bless Lord Supreme Wind of Yutong to arrive at the battlefield soon. This old woman is willing to exchange the rest of my life for this. The same prayer was carried out in every family in the Empire of Yutong. Lord Supreme Cloud, whom all of Yutong had been looking forward to, was now burning with anxiety in the mountains. It had been 24 days. Yun Yang was trapped in the forest under the snow. He could not move. In these days he had thought of countless ways. Mr. Nian, who was above him, had done the same. Now the forest within 50,000 feet of him was completely scorched. The thick layer of snow was gone. Even the grass beneath the ground had lost all signs of life. The biggest rock was no bigger than a fingernail. From top to bottom, Mr. Nian had hacked at the ground, rocks, and trees no less than 10,000 times. It was said that one had to dig 3 feet into the ground. But this time, Mr. Nian had not only dug 3 feet into the ground. He had dug 1,000 feet into the ground. Yun Yang had been injured no less than 200 times in the process. Each time, he had to maintain a clear mind to shift within a small area. Only then could he avoid Mr. Nian's sword energy that was like a dragnet. He had come up with all sorts of methods. Mr. Nian might not be able to find his exact location, but it was hopeless for him to kill his way out of this cage. If he continued like this, the biggest possibility would be, until the end, Mr. Nian would not be able to find him, and he would truly turn into dust under the ground. There would not even be a corpse. After all, his soul was continuously injured. He was already feeling like he could no longer continue. Ever since he was trapped here, he had been hoping for an external force to intervene. As long as there was an external force, he would be able to seize the opportunity to escape. However, there had never been one. Occasionally, there would be martial artists who passed by, but before they could even get close, Mr. Nian's sword light had shattered their souls and killed them from thousands of feet away. He was not even willing to let the spiritual energy of those who had died, which could cause confusion, into this space. Yin Yang could only be furious, but he could not come up with a solution, no matter how hard he racked his brain. There were so many experts in the martial world, the concourse of the underworld, the Four Seasons Tower, Jun Moyan, Long Xiao, and many more. Had none of those legendary figures passed by this place? Where had Lei Dongtian gone? Could that fellow be dead as well? Why was there no news of him? Although this place was remote, but for the people of Jianghu, what place could be called remote? For the first 3 days, Yin Yang waited confidently, but to no avail. For the next 3 days, Yin Yang calculated. Even if it was a coincidence, someone should have passed by this place. But there was still no one. On the 8th day, a few fellows who came to pick herbs, they were all dead before they could even get close. On the 11th day, a few robbers came out of nowhere, wanting to do business, but they were mercilessly killed by Mr. Nian on behalf of heaven. On the 16th day, another true expert passed by. Judging from the situation, he was at least a few levels above the heaven realm, but he too died outside the forest. These days, even the birds that flew in the sky were not spared. Not to mention the snakes and earthworms underground. Even the ants were killed by Mr. Nian. Yin Yang was speechless. Encountering an opponent as persistent as Mr. Nian. Was the Four Seasons Tower so free? As the Four Seasons Tower's leader, shouldn't you go back and take charge of the situation? Why were you still hanging around here? When he was free, Mr. Nian would talk to himself like a chatterbox, using all sorts of malicious words to provoke Yin Yang, wanting him to explode. In the beginning, Yin Yang tried his best to restrain himself. However, in the end he could no longer restrain himself. He did not even have the strength to erupt. Mr. Nian was still hopping around on top, his sword energy raging like a storm. Within the time it took to finish a cup of tea, he had plowed through the entire area. Then, he rested chatterbox, stimulated, and after another cup of tea's time, he would suddenly plow through the area again. Yin Yang even felt that he had turned into water. It was difficult for him to move agilely in this dry land. The 1,000 feet of soil was parched, like the surface of a desert that had been exposed to the sun for a year. How could a few drops of water move through it? If he was not careful, he might even be devoured by the soil directly. Yin Yang was close to despair. Was he, Yin Yang, really going to die here this time? Just when Yin Yang was almost in a daze, unable to move, his mind was a little fuzzy, and he was even thinking of giving up. The turning point had suddenly come. 2 chapters totaling up to 16,700. Everyone who read it chuckled. The author is beautiful and honest. Qi is the most handsome. Chapter 463. This afternoon I wrote half of it. When my wife came over, I asked her to take a look. She gave a suggestion. She said, "You're doing this purely to help the main character get out of trouble. It's a little too deliberate. It's too much like the main character's halo." I thought about it and felt that it made sense. Although the main character's halo was definitely there, it couldn't be done so smoothly. Hence, I discarded the manuscript and thought about it again. Let's see if we can take another path. Give me some time. Chapter 464. When all the cheats could no longer display their effects. When all the manifestations and divine abilities were rendered ineffective, before absolute power, there was only despair. Yin Yang had never been one to give up easily. However, when his life force had been depleted to its limit, even his signs of life were gradually fading. His deific consciousness could not be released, and his eyes could not even be kept open. No matter how indignant and resentful he was, he could only sigh helplessly. Yin Yang had almost lost the ability to revert to his true form and return to the surface to meet Mr. Nian. Although Emmy was still waving its tendrils impatiently in the space, twisting and turning with all its might to supply an endless supply of air of vitality, It was a pity that it was only a drop in the bucket for yin-yang's current condition. It could not keep up with the rate of depletion. It could only shrink its tendrils while ensuring its maximum output, trying its best to reduce its own consumption and assist yin-yang to the best of its ability. Such assistance could only linger at death's door. It was of no help to the overall situation. As yin-yang continued to be injured, his divine sense continued to be damaged as well. Emmy grew more and more exhausted. Although Emmy was in the alternate space, yin-yang's physical and mental condition was the foundation of its survival. Once yin-yang ceased to exist, Emmy would perish as well. Yin-yang, who was underground, was injured physically, mentally, and spiritually due to the incessant injuries. He was slowly losing his strength and could barely hold on. His initial realm was in grave danger, but yin-yang was rather impressed by Mr. Nian, who was above him. This person, this kind of tenacity, this kind of perseverance, is really worthy of admiration. However, yin-yang still had a vague feeling that something was amiss. This Mr. Nian seemed to be a little too free. Who was Mr. Nian? He was the master of the Four Seasons Tower, the master of the 5 venerable lords, the 4 supreme lords, many heaven realm cultivators, and the countless ace cultivators of the Four Seasons Tower. He possessed an unparalleled ability that was on par with the unrivaled expert Ling Xiaozui. For such a person to target him personally, he was giving yin-yang enough face. However, purely in terms of his identity, besides using such methods to obstruct me, isn't it a little overkill? Isn't it a little too demeaning to himself? From yin-yang's point of view, it seemed that only by appearing to save the 4 venerable lords from danger, severely injuring old Mu with a single strike, and ambushing Lei Dongtian with a forceful strike, not staying for long after the deed was done, could he be the owner of the Four Seasons Tower, the world's top organization, and against a cultivator at the beginning stage of the heaven realm like him? He should have just turned around and left after missing his attack. As for the venomous words, the provocative words, and the talkative behavior of Mr. Nian, he did not have the demeanor of a ruler who ruled over the world like Mr. Nian. All in all, yin-yang's encounter with Mr. Nian and his actions were vastly different from Mr. Nian's identity and the impression yin-yang had formed from a glimpse of him. It did not match at all. In this regard, yin-yang was even a little belittled. He knew that what he was doing was futile, yet he kept on chattering. How King lonely are you? Could it be that no one has spoken to you for 800 years or something? However, no matter what, the other party's cultivation base was truly earth-shattering, and there was no doubt that it was at a level that could shock the world. Among all the experts that yin-yang had met in his life, he was unquestionably the best. Just as yin-yang was about to lose hope, or perhaps he had already lost all hope, suddenly, he felt a faint ripple in the massive deific consciousness that shrouded above him. It was as if a powerful presence had suddenly arrived. Who was it? Was it a friend or foe? Yin-yang perked up. Could it be that I am not fated to die yet? Could there be a turning point in this battle? Who was it that had come? Since Mr. Nian did not kill him at once, it must be someone with a high status. Could it be Ling Xiaozui, Jun Moyan? Or perhaps Lei Dongtian had brought his men to seek revenge. Be it from any of the 3, it meant that there was a variable in this battle. What disappointed yin-yang was that the intertwining deific consciousnesses above him were much more peaceful. There was no hostile atmosphere at all. It was obvious that both parties did not intend to fight. Just as yin-yang was filled with hope and disappointment, his heart sinking into despair, Mr. Nian's voice rang from above. Why are you here? Judging from his tone, the person seemed to be Mr. Nian's acquaintance. Was he an enemy as well? Yin-yang felt even more hopeless. One Mr. Nian was enough to make him die a horrible death. Yet another one had come? The other party did not speak, but the ripple of the deific consciousness grew slightly louder. Yin-yang guessed that the person was communicating with Mr. Nian through telepathy. That was probably the truth, because Mr. Nian's voice had disappeared as well. It looked like both of them were cautious people. Even in such a special atmosphere, they were still communicating through telepathy. Yin-yang was even more curious. Who was it that could make Mr. Nian react in such a manner? Although the newcomer appeared to be hostile, and was most likely a foe to Yun-yang, the current situation was already extremely dire. It did not matter if there was one more enemy, especially when this person's arrival had turned Yun-yang's situation into a sliver of hope. Yun-yang forced himself to focus his remaining deific consciousness, focusing all of it to sense the ripple of deific consciousness in the air above him. For a moment his imagination ran wild. Yun-yang had done so because Mr. Nian had not drawn his sword during this period of time. It was the most relaxed moment he had ever been since he had been restricted. Emmy had seized the opportunity to transfer its energy of vitality rapidly. Seeing that the opportunity could not be missed, Yun-yang was naturally in high spirits. Seizing the rare opportunity, he absorbed the energy that Emmy had sent over without restraint and recovered his deific consciousness and body at full speed. Even if he still dared not attempt to break free, he could at least make use of this buffer time to give himself more leverage to contend with Mr. Nian. When Yun-yang had the time to recover, he observed his own body and was shocked to realize that it was like a desert that had been parched for 100 years. Endless life force surged in like a tsunami, but it was absorbed in an instant. There was almost no improvement to be felt. This state lasted for about half a cup of tea's time, before he felt like he had come back to life a little. But he was still extremely weak. Fortunately, the ripple of deific consciousness in the air was still ongoing. Both of them were still conversing, and had not returned to their previous state of targeting Yun-yang. Yun-yang did not know what they were talking about, that they had actually spoken for so long. Yun-yang grew increasingly curious about the person's identity. Looking around the world, there were not many people who could converse with Mr. Nian like this. Yun-yang suddenly had a strange feeling. This person who had suddenly appeared not only had an important identity, but he was afraid that he might be related to him as well. Then the ripple of deific consciousness disappeared, but the swooshing sound increased, more than doubled in intensity. Yun-yang was acutely aware of this reality. Could it be that his doomsday had arrived? The person was extremely powerful. Even if he was not as powerful as Mr. Nian, he was at least of a similar standard. With such a powerful aid, it would be easier for Mr. Nian to target him. Yun-yang had only managed to catch his breath now. He did not have the ability to escape at all. However, the powerful sword energy that he had expected did not appear. There was only the incessant swooshing sound. It was obvious that both of them were performing some sort of movement at an extremely high speed. What were they trying to do? What were they doing? There was only one answer. Yun-yang had already figured it out. Spiritual restraining formation. Yun-yang was utterly hopeless now. There had been a sliver of hope in his heart. But now that things had come to this, it was the final step. His end was finally coming. Mr. Nian had been guarding here for a month, and had not done so. However, this person had changed his method in just a quarter of an hour after he had arrived. It seemed that this method was suggested by the newcomer. Heaven wants me dead. Emmy. Aye. Is there any way to increase my life energy in an instant, so that my cultivation can increase quickly? Yun-yang asked anxiously. This was the only way Yun-yang could think of at the moment. He knew that it was nonsense, but he still asked with a sliver of hope. This was his last hope. He had hoped that someone would interfere, but there was none. Instead, the other party had waited for a powerful aid. Based on the current situation, even if Ling Xiaozui were to come, he would not be of much help. The only thing he could do now was to seek survival in the midst of death. Yeah. Emmy was behaving strangely. It did not deny the idea at once, but it hesitated instead. Yun-yang grew even more anxious and urged. Is there or isn't there? There's really no other way this time. If I can't increase my cultivation base rapidly and escape, there's only death awaiting me. If I die, you won't be able to avoid death as well. What's there to hesitate about? Emmy was still hesitant, not answering for a long time. Updated late today. I've written this paragraph a few times. Uncomfortable. Chapter 465. Emmy's hesitation roused Yun-yang's spirits. The fact that Emmy was hesitant meant that such a method existed. but the price to execute it should be extremely high. I'm not asking for much. I just want to make a breakthrough on my current foundation. I believe you can feel it too. There's an underground river's aura about 3,000 feet below us. As long as I can dive down, I can escape this disaster. Otherwise, everything will be over and I'll definitely die. Yun Yang had long known that the current situation was his only chance of survival. It was one thing to know where the chance of survival was, but it was also an unavoidable reality that he could not reach his destination due to his lack of cultivation base. The space that Mr. Nian had sealed did not only encompass the sky and the ground. There was also a considerable area under the ground, up to a depth of 1,000 feet. All of these were within the forbidden zone of life that Mr. Nian had set up. Further down, however, was an area that Mr. Nian could not control. It was also a new and unfamiliar area that his sword energy had never penetrated. With the holy water charm's ability to sense the source of water, Yun Yang could sense the underground river 3,000 feet below him. However, the pressure at the bottom was getting worse by the day. With every additional foot, the pressure increased. Yun Yang's current position was already the limit of his cultivation method. He could no longer dive any further. Despite knowing where the chance of survival lay, he could only sigh at the river. Actually, underground rivers like the one on the other end existed under all the regions of the continent. The only difference was in depth. The underground river that Yun Yang had sensed was exceptionally deep. It was 3,000 feet deep. Yun Yang felt that this was the most unfortunate part of his situation. Where in the entire continent could there be such a deep underground river? 3,000 feet below ground level? Yet he had encountered it. Yun Yang had a strange thought about it. There was no source of water within 3,000 feet of the ground. What an extraordinary oddity. This had led to the current predicament. Yun Yang had been salivating at the underground river for 20 days. He could not think of a way out. Of course, it was also because the underground river was deep enough, so deep that it exceeded the detection range of Mr. Nian's deific consciousness. Otherwise, there would not even be a chance of survival. This was the only way out, but Yun Yang was not capable enough. It was the reality that it was difficult for him to reach it, so it became an impossible strategy. Now that there was another enemy, although it gave Yun Yang a little more breathing space and time to catch his breath, it also brought the bad news of the spiritual restraining formation. If he did not adapt, only death awaited him. Now, looking at Emmy's hesitation, Yun Yang saw a glimmer of hope to get out of this predicament. He could not help urging it. There was no room for hesitation at this juncture. It was more important to proceed with whatever ideas they had. If they continued to hesitate, it would be too late. Yun Yang could clearly feel that the surrounding spiritual qi of heaven and earth was being forcefully squeezed out in a slow but strangely tangible manner, as if it was being squeezed by someone. It was obvious that the spiritual restraining array was slowly taking shape. This place was about to become a spiritless place like Zilong City, where all manifestation abilities were rendered ineffective. There was not much time left for him. After all, once the spiritual restraining formation was fully operational, his physical body would be annihilated by the earth immediately due to the failure of his manifestation abilities. Aya. Emmy's voice sounded very sorrowful. There was indeed a way. However, the price was so high that it was unknown if it should be carried out. Once it was carried out, the consequences would be unimaginable. From Emmy's point of view, it was better to just die. Even if his physical body was extracted and killed by the spiritual restraining formation, his soul would still exist, and he could be reincarnated as a human. By then there would still be a trace of vitality left. As for Emmy, it would follow Yun Yang, and there would be no loss. However, if it were to adopt this method, it would be equivalent to suicide. A suicide where the soul and spirit would be destroyed. Then there would be no next life. He would be reduced to nothingness. Emmy could indeed forcefully fill all the current energy into Yin Yang's meridians in an extremely short amount of time, filling him with all the life force and karmic chi of good and evil. It would then elevate one of Yin Yang's abilities to a whole new level. This ability was called primordial borrowing. There was another well-known name for it. It was called star borrowing. In an instant, The power of the stars could be extracted and infused into one's body. However, Emmy did not want to do so at all. Otherwise, Yun Yang would not have mentioned it when Emmy had asked him many times when he was on the brink of death. Emmy had 3 concerns. The first was that the battle had come so suddenly. Yun Yang had been at an absolute disadvantage since the beginning, his body, mind, and spirit being injured continuously. More importantly, there was a gap. Even this method needed a certain buffer before it could be carried out. There was no room for it to be carried out previously. Secondly, Yun Yang's cultivation base was still too low. Once he did this, there was a 99% chance that it would not be an enhancement of some ability, but an explosion on the spot. The destruction of his soul and spirit. The power of the stars. Even if each star only provided a ray of starlight, how could Yun Yang withstand it when it was gathered in his body? It was only a body of flesh and blood, yet he had to withstand such a massive force. This outcome was more serious than Yun Yang dying directly, because there were a few different ways to die. For example, if Yun Yang's qi and blood were exhausted and his cultivation method was damaged, his soul would still be intact. As long as Mr. Nian was gone within a certain time limit, with Emmy's current deep understanding of the soul, there was a high chance that it could reassemble Yun Yang's soul and resurrect him, or perhaps reincarnate. However, if the primordial borrowing art failed, Yun Yang would perish immediately. It would be an irrecoverable death. This was also the main reason why Emmy had refused to tell Yun Yang the truth, when he had asked it many times before. Now, however, the situation was different. Once the spiritual restraining formation was formed, Yun Yang's manifestation powers would fail again. The method that Emmy had planned would be utterly hopeless because holy water charm, art of blood, and other cultivation methods could no longer be used. That was why it had no choice but to reveal the primordial borrowing art. However, after Emmy's repeated assessments, with Emmy's ability to operate, in addition to the tenacity of Yin Yang's meridians from consuming the heaven and earth resources, and the endless medicinal potential in his body, the success rate of executing the primordial borrowing art was still less than 10%. After all, even if it was to spoil a seedling to hasten its growth, the seedling had to have a certain foundation and grow to a certain height. With Yin Yang's current physique, there were only 3 outcomes if he were to use this method recklessly. The first possibility was that he would explode and die on the spot, with his soul and spirit destroyed. The possibility of this was more than 90%, almost 100%. The second possibility was that he would become an idiot. This would be if the method was executed properly and succeeded, but his brain would be destroyed by the forceful impact of the energy in the process. Even Emmy could not help him recover from such an outcome. He could only accompany an idiot for the rest of his life. Thinking about it sent chills down Emmy's spine. As for the third possibility, it was the best outcome. He would successfully borrow the art and even escape, but he would still be severely injured afterward and lose his ability to cultivate, becoming an ordinary person. He might even be reduced to an ordinary person, one who was sick all year round and could not enjoy the lifespan of an ordinary person. Emmy would then become a lotus seed once again, floating between heaven and earth. There was a premise for all these possibilities. The manifestation powers of the 9 Supremes, as well as the power of manifestation, would be lost forever. Executing the primordial borrowing art meant that all the attributes in Yin Yang's body would be sucked dry. The 5 elements converged, heaven and man became one. Yin and Yang merged, the primordial borrowing art. Of course, there was another possibility. Not only did Yin Yang not die, his cultivation base had improved tremendously, and he would be invincible from then on. However, this possibility was no longer minuscule. Emmy had never even considered this possibility, not even daring to think about it. Emmy guessed that the possibility was about 1 in 100 billion. In spite of this, Emmy knew that Yin Yang really did not have time now. The spiritual restraining formation had begun to be set up outside. If he did not act now, there would really be no more chance. Although Emmy was unwilling to let Yin Yang take such a risk, it could only support him now, because this method with no chance of survival was really the only hope they had now. If he did not do this, he could only wait to become a corpse here. His soul and body would still be destroyed, and he would be doomed eternally. The only exception was, however, even if I were to execute this method, I still need a chance, because there will be some aura leaking the moment I activate it. After all, there are still two unparalleled experts setting it up above. With their divine senses, they only need to release sword energy at the place where the aura is being emitted, and everything will be over, a step earlier. Yin Yang racked his brain for ideas. He had a countermeasure now. But how could he restrain the two unparalleled experts above? It would be good to distract them for a moment. Up above, two figures were busying themselves, constantly throwing down a piece of jade that emitted a rainbow glow. The moment it landed on the ground, it would sink deep into the soil and disappear. A small-scale spiritual restraining formation could be set up very quickly, as long as there were sufficient materials and mystical chi cultivation base. With what the two of them were doing, it did not require much effort at all. There was only one corner left to complete the spiritual restraining formation. Once the setup was completed, whether Supreme Cloud had turned into wind, water, or any other form, his manifestation would be removed, and he would return to his human form. Perhaps, his physical body would be completely crushed by the underlying force. The two men were about to toss the materials in their hands out to complete the last bit of the setup. It was at this moment that a strange wave came from beneath the ground. Had Supreme Cloud made his move? Was he making his final struggle against the most dreaded spiritual restraining formation before his eyes? Mr. Nian frowned. He could not help concentrating, the long sword in his hand beginning to hum. Another person floated down from midair and stood beside Mr. Nian. His expression was solemn as he observed the area where the commotion had occurred. In the next moment, however, both of their expressions changed at the same time. We've been tricked. Behind both of them, a powerful and direct wave of energy had appeared abruptly. A ray of rainbow light had shot out from the ground. Swoosh! The radiance was already thousands of feet above the sky in an instant. Chapter 466. Both of them roared at the same time. Boundless sword energy left their hands and pointed straight at the rainbow radiance in the sky. At the same time, both of them sprung up as well, charging over at their highest speed. However, just as the two of them rushed up, there was another strange fluctuation coming from below. Moreover, it wasn't from one place, but from three different directions at the same time. It was as if Supreme Cloud had gone berserk underground. Mr. Nian and his companion were still quick to react. There was no hesitation throughout the entire process. One of them maintained the momentum of a comet as he chased after the rainbow silhouette in midair, while the other turned back immediately, pouncing towards the ripples on the ground. From rushing to higher ground to turning back, the entire process was as smooth as flowing water. There was not the slightest bit of reluctance. Sword light flashed. With a soft cry, Mr. Nian flew out like a dragon. Looking down from above, his sword energy was unleashed to its limit. At this moment, Mr. Nian's sword energy and sword light were like giant axes that could split heaven and earth apart, slashing down with an earth-shattering force. The current situation was within Mr. Nian's expectations. He had long predicted that Supreme Cloud would not wait for his death, especially when the spiritual restraining formation that was aimed at him came again. He would definitely make a last-ditch effort at the last moment, and this was Supreme Cloud's only chance to strike. Therefore, Mr. Nian had long been ready to strike. Even though everything seemed to have happened out of the blue, he was actually well prepared. Furthermore, this was the decisive strike, so the force of his attack was several times stronger than before. With a loud bang, the three locations were shrouded by flashes of sword light at the same time. In an instant, dust filled the sky. The strange sword chi with a strange attribute immediately covered the space of 1,000 feet around the three locations. Yin Yang, who was performing his mystic art, felt as if he had been struck by lightning. His heart stopped abruptly. The moment Yin Yang's heart stopped, Emmy's unique mystical energy surged into him like a great river. At the same time, The sky that was supposed to be as bright as day suddenly appeared amidst the snow-filled sky. Densely packed, they shot out abruptly, forming a miraculous scene of starlight illuminating the sun. It fell like a long river. High up in the sky, the person who was in hot pursuit slashed at the rainbow silhouette, but he was surprised to find that the falling object was indestructible. Upon closer inspection, he realized that the rainbow silhouette was actually a saber. It was a mysterious saber with a strange shape, but it looked exceptionally beautiful. It was a saber that no one could bear to part with. The fact that the saber light could withstand a full-force strike from a master of such a level, without being destroyed, was already a testament to its extraordinary quality. Delighted, the person reached out to grab it, but did not forget to remind Mr. Nian on the other end. Complete the spiritual restraining formation immediately. Below, Mr. Nian's sword light shot out, but he suddenly felt the ground shake as the starlight from the horizon fell straight down. The power of heaven and earth was so overwhelming that even a powerhouse like Mr. Nian dared not face it head-on. Mr. Nian knew that things were not looking good, so he made a prompt decision. The few remaining pieces of rainbow crystals in his hands flew out and flew towards the designated location, like a meteor chasing after the moon. In the sky, just as that person's finger was about to touch the blade of heaven's will, the blade of heaven's will suddenly flashed and mysteriously disappeared. On the ground, the entire mountain began to shake. Dust rose thousands of feet into the sky, threatening to cover the sun. For a moment, one could not even see their fingers or see anything. The rumbling was deafening as dozens of mountains crumbled at the same time. The power of the stars fell with a tremendous force, disintegrating all the mountains within 100,000 feet radius. The ground quaked as if the entire continent was enraged. Faced with such a phenomenon, Mr. Nian could only watch in shock, his mind blank. What was going on? Supreme Cloud? If Supreme Cloud had such capability, it would not be difficult for him to fight him head-on, or even kill him. How could he have been forced into such a state? However, if this was not Supreme Cloud's doing, what was going on? Beneath the ground, not only did Yun Yang, who had been channeled by Emmy, regain his vigor, but a tremendous force surged into his body with a boom. Yun Yang felt his body tremble violently, his soul almost completely shattered at that moment. He forcefully endured the excruciating pain, relying on the last bit of clarity in his mind to cast the holy water charm once more. Driven by the boundless force, Yun Yang's holy water charm cultivation base was elevated to a terrifying height in an instant. It was as if all the water in the world was under his control. He unleashed it with all his might. Almost in the blink of an eye, the water 3,000 feet below the ground suddenly surged upward with a loud boom. Yun Yang, who was channeling the holy water charm with all his might, endured the excruciating pain that felt like his soul was being torn apart, and dived with all his might, following the space where Mr. Nian's sword energy had landed. In the blink of an eye, he had already dived at least 2,000 feet deep. Yun Yang could already faintly feel the chill of the underground river beneath his feet. He felt relieved, and was about to go with the current, when the spiritual restraining formation was unexpectedly activated. Yun Yang felt his body grow heavy, losing his water manifestation, and returning to his human form. Following the inertia, he tumbled into the surging underground river. Without the control of the holy water charm, the underground river's water, that fell instantly brought rolling sand and Yun Yang's body along with it, plunging straight into the depths of the ground. In an instant, it had returned to its original flow of the underground river, surging forward like a great river. In the blink of an eye, he had already gone somewhere unknown. With a boom, the mountains exploded. Gravel pierced through the air and waves filled the sky. It was a scene of the end of the world. On the ground, the two men waved their long sleeves. Their expressions did not change in the face of the collapsing mountains and splitting earth. They waved their sleeves calmly, brushing away the shattered rocks and flying dust. One on the left and the other on the right, the two men parted all the gravel around them before diving down like two bolts of lightning. Rumbling sounds could be heard from time to time. It was the sound of the two men knocking the rocks that had just been shattered aside, or smashing them into smithereens. As far as the eye could see, the 2,000 feet deep still had traces of the underground river gushing up. It was still damp. Both men exerted their strength at the same time. With the flash of their swords and a loud boom, they plunged another 100 feet down. But there was no trace of Yin Yang. They repeated this for more than a dozen times. After a dozen consecutive strikes, the rumbling sound of the underground river could be faintly heard. Just as the two men were about to continue their efforts and reach the underground river to continue their pursuit of Yin Yang, the aftermath of the landslide above them finally showed itself. With a deafening rumble, both sides of their heads caved in at the same time. For a moment, not only was there a scene of devastation, but the landscape had also changed. Both men cursed, unleashing their thick mystical chi at once in an attempt to withstand the earth-shattering force with their own domineering force. Both of their cultivations were already at the pinnacle of the world. Even a landslide wouldn't be able to cause any harm to them. In spite of this, they could not stop the inertia of the collapsing rocks and soil. When the collapse ended, both men were shocked to find that they had returned to a position close to the surface. The thousands of feet wide hole beneath their feet that they had just created was now sealed tightly by the collapsed rocks and soil. Supreme Cloud's aura had truly vanished this time. There was not a single trace of him left. Arg! The person who came next howled into the sky. His hands parted and two rays of sword light shot out at the same time. It was obvious that the person was still unwilling to give up. He did not want to give up the chance to kill Supreme Cloud just like that. Countless rocks and soil flew out once more in response to the sword light. Mr. Nian also lent a helping hand at the right time. An hour later, a super deep hole that was more than 300 zhang deep had appeared where the two of them stood. The width at the top was no less than 10,000 zhang, and it looked like a huge funnel. In front of both men, they were already 3,000 feet below the ground. A raging underground river, only 20 to 30 feet wide, and of unknown depth, surged and flowed into the other end of the pitch-black hole on the other side. Mr. Nian's expression was ferocious. With a rub of his hands, a staff made entirely of mystical chi appeared in his hands. He plunged it directly into the underground river, and lengthened it, until it was about 100 feet long, before he could confirm the bottom. The underground river was only 30 feet wide, but 100 feet deep. The current was rapid. After such a long time, with Supreme Cloud's water manifestation ability like Supreme Waters, it was likely that he was nowhere to be found by now. Moreover, this was different from before. Supreme Cloud's shapeshifting ability could be put to good use here. Even though they knew that he was in this underground river, there was nothing they could do. They could not catch him any longer. Who would know which drop of water was Supreme Cloud in the entire river? Even if their cultivation base was impeccable, it was impossible for them to evaporate the underground river completely. He's gone. Mr. Nian sighed softly, a strange glint flashing across his eyes. He truly did not expect that he would fail to eliminate the 9 Supremes remnant, even after he had personally come out with his overwhelming ability and planned ahead. Every move he made was highly targeted. Supreme Cloud is not fated to die yet. We can only look for another chance next time. The other man said faintly. However, the next chance is right before our eyes. We only need to look for it on the battlefield. Yutong is at a critical juncture now. As long as Supreme Cloud gets out, he'll definitely go to the battlefield. That's true. He has something to worry about. It's hard for him to escape death. Mr. Nian nodded. Both men exchanged glances and flew up without hesitation to return to the ground. Keeping the spiritual stones used to set up the spiritual restraining formation, they soared into the sky and headed east. On the ground, water slowly seeped out of the funnel-shaped hole dug out by the two experts. It was like a gigantic eye glinting with sarcasm. This plot is driving me to death. Chapter 467. In the blink of an eye, both Mr. Nian and Yin Yang had disappeared without a trace. He had no lingering feelings for this strange lake that he had created with his own hands. What Mr. Nian did not know was that his departure meant that he had truly lost the best chance to kill Supreme Cloud. The moment Yin Yang landed, the spiritual restraining formation had been successfully activated. Yin Yang's shapeshifting ability had completely vanished at that moment, reverting to his human form. Due to the backlash of the arcane art, he had fallen into a coma and could only drift forward along with the underground river. Mr. Nian only needed to jump into the underground river and search ahead. He would be able to find Yin Yang within a few dozen miles. He would be able to kill him effortlessly. However, he had not thought of this. After all, Supreme Water had transformed into water, and his ability to hide in water form was too deeply ingrained in people's minds. Mr. Nian would never believe that his ability would be sealed by the spiritual restraining formation when he had successfully escaped under such circumstances. What was more, someone who possessed the ability to create such an earth-shattering event would faint because he could not withstand the backlash. It did not make sense at all. Therefore, Mr. Nian had easily let go of the once-in-a-lifetime chance to kill Supreme Cloud. Yin Yang, who had reverted to his physical form, had been swept far away by the underground river. Unconscious, he could only drift with the current passively. When he woke up again, he was surprised to find himself at the edge of a shallow pool. Looking around, he realized that there was a huge mountain behind him. It was a lofty mountain with steep ridges and lush greenery, as far as his eyes could see. Looking from afar, he could not help but feel at ease. A stream of water, like a raging dragon, gushed out from a deep cave, seemingly endless. Yin Yang woke up slowly. As he scanned his surroundings subconsciously, he almost fainted again before he could rejoice at the fact that he had survived the ordeal. Closing his eyes almost instinctively and breathing in the fresh air, Yin Yang was finally sure that he was still alive. In the next moment, it was not to rejoice that he had escaped death, but to be assaulted by endless agony. His head felt like it was about to explode. The sudden pain caused Yin Yang to spasm. He wanted to roar to vent some of the pain, but he was shocked to realize that he could not even make a sound. It was as if his throat was being sliced by thousands of knives. But at this moment, the physical pain was nothing in comparison. The key was his brain. It was like countless stars exploding in his brain one after another. Yin Yang was in excruciating pain, his eyeballs almost popping out of their sockets. He tried his best to control his mystical qi to suppress the strange state of his body, but he realized that his dantian was empty. There was not even a trace of mystical qi left. Yin Yang cultivated the endless divine art in agony, only to realize that the divine art that had been with him ever since he had returned to the world had disappeared from his body. He wanted to open his sea of consciousness and ask for Emmy's help, but he was still disappointed. He could not connect with his sea of consciousness at the moment. His cultivation base, mystical skill, deific consciousness, dantian, and sea of qi were all silent. They were even worse than ordinary people. Feeling the endless pain that was like the waves of the ocean, wave after wave, Yin Yang had the urge to commit suicide countless times in just a short quarter of an hour. Yin Yang used the only finger of his right hand that he could move to grip a large rock beside him, gripping it tightly until his finger bones were broken. Blood dripped from his wound, but he could not feel the pain from his finger wound at all. All he could feel was the incessant stabbing pain in his mind. Wave after wave, again and again, it was as if there was no end to it. I want revenge. Unable to make a sound, Yin Yang was roaring in his heart, using his will to fight against the endless pain. My brothers are still waiting for me to avenge them. I have to hold on no matter what. To be able to escape from this battle means that the heavens have not forsaken me. I can't give up. I can't give up on everyone's blood feud. I must annihilate the Four Seasons Tower and kill Mr. Nian, and all those who ambushed our brothers that day. I'll never give up if I don't avenge this. Yin Yang's eyes bulged, his temples throbbing. His veins bulged like two raging dragons. He gritted his teeth, allowing blood to flow from the corners of his mouth. At this moment, he no longer dared to cry out. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth to cry out, his willpower would completely collapse. He shut his mouth tightly, gritted his teeth, and gripped the rock with his fingers. It was obvious that he no longer had the slightest bit of profound energy to support his broken fingers, but they were actually slowly embedded into the rock. The hard rock that had been washed by the water, for who knew how many years slowly, began to show signs of being scratched. Yin Yang's eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if there was a great temptation in front of him, but it was actually just an ordinary scenery that could be seen everywhere. Yin Yang's mind was filled with images of his brothers coming to him, their gentle and comforting gazes. "Brother, Xiaojiao, hang in there. We're all waiting for you. Supreme Cloud can't fall. The 9 Supremes can't be annihilated. Remember to avenge us." The warm words were still in his ears, comforting Yin Yang's parched heart. The scene changed abruptly, turning into a sea of blood and mountains of corpses. Blood and broken limbs littered the ground while crows cawed in the sky. Pairs of eyes that had died with grievances stared at the sky, their gazes frozen with grief and indignation. Those were his brothers. His 8 brothers. His 800 brothers. Mr. Nian's voice rang like the devil again. "That's Supreme Earth, isn't it? He's been beaten until his flesh and blood burst. Who's the other Supreme?" Seeing that Supreme Earth is dead, he actually went crazy and charged over to seek his own death. Coincidentally, he was slashed into 2 with a single slash. A hoarse growl escaped Yin Yang's throat. There was only madness in his gaze. Hints of savagery flashed through his frozen gaze. Then his father appeared. His wrinkled face was still smiling warmly. "Child, do you know how to make the Chinese cabbage and tofu that I've taught you? Is it delicious?" Yin Zuiyu, who was dressed in white, looked at him sadly. "Young brother, don't give up. You mustn't give up." The scene changed again. It was Dongshuan's million-strong army, ready for battle. Han Sanhe, who was overseeing the army, was issuing an order spontaneously. "Today, we shall finish this battle in one fell swoop. We shall annihilate Yutong. We shall not return without victory." The flags of the 4-nation coalition army covered the sky. Countless men and horses swarmed into the peaceful homes of Yutong's people. Countless innocent people were struggling under the iron hooves, howling and crying in despair. 9 Supremes Lords. Save us, 9 Supremes Lords. 9 Supremes Lords, where are you? The spiritual restraining formation. The spiritual restraining formation had appeared again. The 4 Seasons Tower. A domineering voice rang out. "Kill the 9 Supremes. There shall be no saint in the universe. Only the 4 Seasons Tower shall dominate the world." Yin Yang's eyes were wide open, watching the images flash before his eyes. He stared at them without blinking, enduring the boundless pain. The agony that Yin Yang was currently enduring, even if it was only a quarter of an hour, was enough to turn a man of steel, who was not afraid of death, into a soft worm. Even if 100 people were to perform the tendon dislocation skill on one person at the same time, it would not be as painful as 100th of this. If it had been anyone else, they would have long been overwhelmed and given up. After all, living like this was much more difficult than dying. However, Yin Yang had endured it. Endured it. He had endured it for a whole day and night. When Yin Yang was restrained by the spiritual restraining formation previously, not only did it render his water manifestation ineffective, it had also caused the primordial borrowing art to go out of control and cause him to suffer an unprecedented injury. In addition, he had lost his cultivation base, mystical skill, and deific consciousness. Now he could not even move a muscle. His right hand, the only part of his body that could move, had been crippled by Yin Yang himself. Yin Yang, who could not move, was left with only his sense of sight and touch. He could feel the light before his eyes slowly dimming, turning into darkness. The stars twinkled, the night fog and the cold wind blew slowly, the sky was overcast. A chill fell on his face. It was snowing. Was it snowing again? The side of his face gradually turned silvery white as the heavy snow fell from the sky. His eyes that were once glaring in anger were gradually covered by the white snow, and he could no longer see what was before him. However, the flame in his heart burned higher and higher, while the pain in his head grew more intense, not slowing down even as time passed. Streaks of blood seeped slowly from the snow that had been frozen on his face. Then, it was frozen again, seeped out again, and froze again. Yin Yang remained motionless, the excruciating pain in his head making his heart churn. "I have to hold on no matter what. I have to get through this. Only by getting through this can I seek revenge." The night passed slowly as the snow grew thicker. Yin-yang was completely covered by the white snow. With Yin-yang's current physical condition, where he had lost his cultivation base, and was severely injured, the snow alone was enough to endanger his life. The next day at dawn, arg! A roar that was so hoarse that it was almost inaudible, but it had exhausted all of Yin-yang's energy gushed out of his mouth. At the same time, a gust of white air spurted out of his mouth along with the arg. He could finally move. The excruciating pain in his head was still there, but it was much lighter than yesterday. Occasionally, when a wave of pain came, the two green veins on Yin-yang's temples would bulge, and his brain would sink into the excruciating pain that felt like it was being torn apart. However, as long as he could get through this wave of pain, he would be able to catch his breath. Compared to the agony that had lasted for an entire night, the slight respite he had now was more than enough for Yin-yang to feel relieved. Yin-yang could not help but let his imagination run wild. After going through this painful training, he believed that 99% of the punishments in this world would be ineffective on him. Even if all of them were applied to him at once, Yin-yang was confident that he could hold on until he died without making a single sound. The so-called punishment, compared to what he was experiencing now, compared to the agony, was truly insignificant, not even worth mentioning. Yin-yang panted and tried to control his body to move. He placed his right hand on the ground, trying to prop himself up. Another wave of pain assaulted him. This time, the pain did not originate from his brain, but from his right hand, where his broken fingers were. Then, the physical pain throughout his body seemed to have been awakened from its slumber and flared up like a tidal wave. Yin-yang grunted in agony. The physical pain was unusually intense, but it was still not something that could be endured by ordinary people. However, Yin-yang, who had been assaulted by the extreme pain in his brain for a day and night, was still able to tolerate it, even though he was not to the extent of ignoring it. His body moved with great effort, moved a little, moved again, and with a flip, he finally moved away from his original position. And with another flip, he was back to facing the sky. The ice and snow that had covered his face for the whole night had all fallen off. What appeared in front of Yin-yang now was a dusky sky. Snow was still fluttering like goose feathers. However, the icy coldness that fell on his face seemed to be able to lessen his pain a little. Only then did Yin-yang have the time to check on his current physical condition, to confirm the extent of the damage he had sustained. He vaguely remembered that his right leg seemed to have been broken in the underground river. Even the slightest movement from his tibia would cause him pain. What was even more frightening was that he could not feel the lower half of his right leg. Yin-yang wanted to confirm the situation, but he could not straighten himself, so he could only touch it with his hands. Finally, the broken part of his right leg was still attached to his body, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Other than his broken right leg, his left arm was broken into a few pieces as well, hanging by his side like a snake. 3 to 4 of his ribs were broken as well. The situation was out of Yin-yang's expectation. Good. He had thought that he would have at least 8 to 9 broken ribs, but only 3 to 4 were broken. Yin-yang was pleasantly surprised. His right arm had been preserved among his 4 limbs, but it was a pity that he had committed suicide and crushed it. All 5 of his fingers were broken and bloody. Lastly, his left leg was completely numb, but there was no sense of pain. It must have been a problem with his posture. When he turned over just now, he felt a sizable wound on the back of his head. There was no blood, so it must have formed a scar. It was the same with his external injuries. There was not a single spot that was not injured. Yin-yang wanted to use his internal vision to check on his internal injuries, but he realized that he still could not muster any spiritual energy after a night. However, the injuries to his internal organs seemed to be equally severe. What confused Yin-yang the most was Emmy. He could not contact Emmy at all. This also meant that he could not use his biggest trump card, the super cheat of life force. As for Whitey and Gigi, they had been thrown into Emmy's space by Yin-yang. Now he could not find anyone to help him even if he wanted to. Yin-yang laid on the muddy ground, panting as he controlled his breathing. The injury this time feels more serious than the battle at Tianxian Cliff. At least Emmy could save me last time. But this time, even Emmy is silent. Yin Yang sighed. However, it seems that my current situation doesn't match the few possibilities Emmy mentioned. I didn't perish on the spot. I didn't become an idiot. And I didn't become an invincible expert. Even the possibility of becoming an ordinary person doesn't seem to be. Yin Yang could clearly feel that his dantian was not crippled. Although he could not muster any mystical qi now, it was only because of his injuries and exhaustion. After recovering a little, he could still muster mystical qi. This means that I'm not crippled. Yin Yang felt that he could actually find a shred of comfort in such a hopeless and tragic situation. However, Emmy was right about one thing. The power that belonged to the 9 Supremes in his body was gone. Not even a trace of its existence was left behind. However, Yin Yang realized that there seemed to be another strange force in his body. However, this force did not listen to his command. Yin Yang did not know how lucky he was. Why was Emmy unwilling to use this method until the very end? It was because Yin Yang had no hope of pulling through. If he used it, only death awaited him. To use the power of a mortal to activate the treasure of heaven's will. To communicate with the power of the stars and infuse it into the human body. What kind of physique could withstand such an enormous force? How much power does a star have? It could be said that a star could be a Tianxian continent. It could even be bigger than the Tianxian continent. Even if it was a smaller star. How small could it be if it could exist in the night sky for eternity? To activate the power of the stars in one go, what kind of person could eat tens of thousands of Tianxian continents in one go? Everything else aside, even if Yin Yang were to consume all the treasures of heaven and earth in the Tianxian continent right now, it would be enough for him to explode 1,000 times. Although each star transmitted an insignificant amount of energy to the celestial body, there were too many of them. Yin Yang was not supposed to be spared. However, the most fortunate thing was that Mr. Nian had activated the spiritual restraining formation the moment the starlight shone down on him. The spiritual restraining formation weakened a portion of the power of the stars, while Yin Yang immediately entered the underground river, preventing most of the stars' power from entering due to the spiritual restraining formation's influence. When the power of the stars broke through the spiritual restraining formation, Yin Yang was already in the underground river, drifting far away. Just like that, the power of the stars fell on the ground and into the funnel lake. From there, it became a blessed land. In time, spiritual herbs would surely appear in droves. On the other hand, Yin Yang had managed to escape the danger of exploding. Due to the spiritual restraining formation, Yin Yang's human form had sealed a portion of the power of the stars in his body. This power of the stars was the force that Yin Yang felt. But it was not the mystical qi force that Yin Yang thought it was. Half a day later, the sun was high up in the sky. Yin Yang took a deep breath and rolled around. Using his broken arm to support himself, he finally managed to sit up. It was only then that he realized that he was on a beach. Beneath him was sand that was as fine as powder. Less than half a foot in front of him, a river gushed into the distance. One of his legs was still soaking in the water. He turned his head, wanting to look elsewhere, but he heard a cracking sound coming from his neck. It was so painful that he was almost tearing up. His neck bone had been dislocated. After confirming his position, he shrugged his shoulders and twisted his neck with a loud crack, turning the dislocated part back. He shuddered in pain. His neck could finally turn. Covered in mud and ragged, Yin Yang felt like a zombie that had crawled out of a grave. Around him, the mountains and rivers were covered in snow. Looking around, there were no footprints on the snowy ground, only a few shallow triangular paw prints. Some kind of bird must have stopped there. With his current strength, he would never be able to walk out. However, this place seemed to be deserted. He recalled the legends about a certain senior who fell into the abyss or the underground river, always encountering a fortuitous encounter, meeting an unparalleled expert, and learning an invincible martial arts skill. Yin Yang looked left and right, but there seemed to be no trace of any fortuitous encounter or expert. Instead, he was about to starve to death. When he was trapped, Emmy provided him with energy, so he did not feel hungry. Now, however, His body was made of flesh and blood. He would starve to death if he did not eat. He still wore the spatial ring given by Lei Dongtian on his finger, but without mystical qi, he could not even open the ring. Yin Yang moved his body with great difficulty. Just pulling his feet out of the water and turning his body bit by bit on the beach was already so painful that he almost fainted several times. Then he found a place he could lean on and leaned against his back. Only then did he dare to lie down and open his mouth to swallow the snow that was covered in mud and sand from his movement. Swallowing a mouthful of snow, he felt that his stomach was frozen as well, but his spirits were lifted. After a dozen mouthfuls, the last mouthful of snow melted in his mouth, and he spat out the mud and sand. Yin Yang sighed and realized that he could speak now. Enduring the pain in his throat, he called out hoarsely, "Is there anyone here?" It was quiet all around. There was no reply. Yin Yang immediately stopped this unwise action. Looking around, he was now under the riverbed, and there was a groove in front of him. Even if someone passed by, they would not be able to see him. Besides, his voice was too weak and could not travel far. A few more cries would exhaust his remaining strength. What he needed the most now was to save himself. Yin Yang used both his arms and legs to crawl forward on the snowy ground, ignoring his broken limbs. There was a gentle slope in front of him. In the river below the slope, Yin Yang noticed that there were a few stones covered in snow. That was where the water flow was relatively slow, and the river was not deep. Then what were these stones for? It meant that someone was crossing the river, using these stones as a cushion. If that was the case, although the slope was covered in snow, it was also a path that must be taken to cross the river. Yin Yang could see that side from where he was, but if he were to look over, he would not be able to see Yin Yang due to the cliff. Therefore, what Yin Yang needed to do now was to climb over there. It was only a distance of 100 feet. Usually, Yin Yang could jump over it with his eyes closed, but now, this distance of 100 feet was like 1,000 mountains and rivers to Yin Yang. It was so difficult to cross it. He crawled on the snowy ground bit by bit, trying to control his balance using his chin, his broken arm, his shoulder, and even his abdomen. Inch by inch, he inched forward. He had to control himself and not slide back because of the icy snow when he crawled forward. It was noon when he started crawling over from the river. However, it was already dark when he reached the edge of the slope. Yin Yang could no longer hold on. He laid quietly on the snowy ground and fainted. Before he fainted, he could only stretch his bleeding right hand forward and place it higher than his body on the snowy ground. This way, if someone came by, even if his body was covered in snow, he could still see his hand. He could also see the fresh red of blood. After doing all this, Yin Yang fainted. The rest was up to the heavens. If someone passed by and had a kind heart, he would still have a sliver of hope. If no one passed by, or if those who passed by ignored him, then he might have to leave this world forever. "Brothers, if you can see me from heaven, send someone to save me," Yin Yang mumbled to himself in his coma. Chapter 468. When Yin Yang woke up again, he was shocked to realize that there seemed to be a faint light lingering beside him. There was a group of people fighting beside him. Let me see too. Let me see this rare thing, this rare person. Unbelievable. It's really rare. F***CKme. I couldn't believe it when I heard it just now. So it's true. Amazing. This is F***king amazing. Tisk tsk tisk. What a miracle. I can't be sure if it's a miracle or not, but at least it's a miracle. Your father will kneel, will you? This is unbelievable, unbelievable. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I really wouldn't believe it. Yin Yang was dumbfounded. What was going on? What nonsense was this? Yin Yang opened his eyes and saw a row of heads hovering in front of him. All of them were staring at him with curious and shocked eyes, as if they had seen something rare and precious. It felt like a group of people were watching and saying, "Wow, there's a big tiger in a cage here." Although Yin Yang had the reputation of being a popinjay in the past, his looks were truly outstanding. He was used to being looked at and admired by others. It was only right for beautiful things to be admired by others. Now, however, he knew himself best. What was there to look at with his looks now? Yun Yang could still feel his head throbbing in pain, but he could not help asking, "What are you all looking at?" Once he spoke, Yun Yang was taken aback. He could actually speak, and his enunciations were very clear. "He's awake, he's awake, he's alive. Oh my God, he's still alive with such a serious injury. Not only is he alive, he can even speak. I heard it clearly just now. Miracle. This is definitely a miracle. It's not fake at all. Old Lu, the person you saved is alive. Your efforts were not in vain." Yun Yang understood at once when he heard that. He had been saved by a kind-hearted person, and the reason these people were watching him was actually because they were surprised that he was still alive after such a serious injury. At this time, an elder appeared in front of Yun Yang with an amiable smile on his face. After studying Yun Yang for a long time, he heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Young friend, you're really lucky. If it had been anyone else, they would have died 1,000 times over after suffering such severe external and internal injuries. But young friend, you're actually alive. Once you've woken up, your vigor is growing stronger. It's unbelievable. This old man has been practicing medicine for so many years, but this is the first time I've seen such severe injuries and such a unique condition." Yun Yang replied strenuously, "Thank you, elder, for saving me. It's a good thing that you've regained your vitality, but your injuries can't be rushed. You need to recuperate." The old man smiled. "Just now, I brewed a bowl of medicine for you. Drink it quickly and go back to sleep. For you, complete rest is the best way to recover." With a single thought, Yun Yang felt that all the injuries on his body had been treated. The broken bones all over his body were all fixed by some bamboo sticks and wooden blocks. His chest, back, and all over his body made him look like a mummy. Of course, Yun Yang dared not rest right away. He asked again, "May I ask, old uncle, where is this place? Which country does it belong to?" The old man looked at him in surprise and said, "This is the southeast of the Empire of Yutong, belonging to the Empire of Yutong's Tianan Path. It's a small mountain village under the jurisdiction of Starlight City's Chioshui district. It's called Yellow Mountain Pass Village. Tianan Road, Starlight City, Chioshui County." Yun Yang heaved a long sigh of relief, his gaze a little lost. He knew of the Tianan Path and Starlight City that the old man mentioned, but he knew nothing about Chioshui County. However, since this place belonged to Starlight City, it shouldn't be too far away. Therefore, this place should be about 5,700 kilometers away from the eastern battlefront. If Yun Yang's ability had not been damaged, he could have covered this 5,700 kilometers in 2 hours. Now, however, Yun Yang closed his eyes dejectedly. Even if he were to go to the battlefield now, what could he do? He had lost his cultivation base. His external and internal injuries were unusually heavy, especially his manifestation powers. He was even weaker than an ordinary martial artist. If he were to really go to the battlefield, he might just lose his life in the blink of an eye. Therefore, the only priority now was to heal his injuries and recover his cultivation base as soon as possible. As for how much he could recover, everything would be left to the future. Right now, the only thing he could not do was to give up. He closed his eyes to rest and recuperate, but the people beside him were talking. "I wonder who this fellow is. He looks like he came from the battlefield." That's most likely the case. Looking at him, even 10,000 people wouldn't be able to beat him up so miserably. Is the battle really so tragic? One can see the general trend from the smallest detail. It's obvious how terrifying it was. I wonder how Xiaolu and the rest are doing now. At the mention of this topic, everyone sighed, and the atmosphere became silent for a while. Yun Yang opened his eyes and turned his head with difficulty to ask, "War?" It was only then that he noticed that the onlookers around him were mostly middle-aged and elderly people in their 40s or 50s. Any one of them had a face full of wrinkles, traces of weathering and vicissitudes. One of them asked, "You didn't come from the battlefield?" Yun Yang sighed. "I was on the way to reinforce the battlefield. I was beaten up by experts from other countries. Oh my God, the road to the battlefield is so difficult. And there were ambushes by experts from other countries along the way?" The group of people was stunned when they heard him. The Empire has issued a death warrant. All citizens have joined the war, swearing to protect their homeland. An elder saw through Yin Yang's confusion and explained, "We are small villagers from the mountains, but everyone has a responsibility when the country is in danger. The young hunters in this village have all been organized, a total of 36 people, to go to the battlefield. I wonder if they can arrive safely." Yin Yang felt a surge of warmth in his heart. If the world was at peace and Yutong was at peace, we would naturally hide here and stand aloof from the world, seeking only peace and happiness. However, now that we're facing an autumn of destruction, although we're ordinary people, we can't live in peace. Sending our children to the battlefield to help is our duty. We don't seek to turn the tide, but we seek to have a clear conscience as Yutong's people when the country is in danger. The few old men's faces were filled with solemnity. "Sai, actually, you were discovered by Xiaolu and the rest when they crossed the river and left the mountain. We thought you were a wounded soldier from the battlefield, but as Yutong's people, we naturally felt a sense of kinship, so we sent you back and instructed us to take good care of you." An elder said kindly, "Child, you've been injured from the battle after all. Since that's the case, you're Yutong's warrior. As long as you're still breathing, we'll try our best to save you, even if we have to spend all our wealth. Recuperate in peace." Another elder said seriously, "You're right. This is what we all know. All those who are injured on the battlefield are our heroes. What's more, your injuries are so severe." The meaning behind his words was clear. If he had not gone through an unusually brutal battle, how could his injuries be so severe? Yet, he was still alive despite such injuries. This had already proven that Yin Yang was not an ordinary person. One could only imagine how brutal the battle Yin Yang had faced was. At the same time, it also proved his identity as Yutong's hero, a warrior on the battlefield. Yin Yang said softly, "I'm ashamed." The few elders comforted him hurriedly. Yin Yang felt a burning passion in his heart, an unprecedented surge of emotion surging within him. With such a nation, how could Yutong be annihilated? How could it be annihilated? Then, afraid that they would disturb Yin Yang's rest, the elders left the room quietly and closed the door. Yin Yang could still hear the soft sighs outside. "I wonder if the 9 Supreme's lords can join the war this time or not. I heard that the situation this time is unprecedentedly dangerous. Dongxian is invading with the entire nation's military force." That's right. If not, how could His Majesty have given the order to fight to the death, mobilizing the entire nation to face the national crisis together? The severity of the current situation is unprecedented. We've finally had a few years of peace, but now it's going to be chaos again. Sigh. I don't get it. Yutong has never provoked the other countries in recent years, nor have we initiated a war. Why do these countries have to target us so relentlessly? Could it be that they can only die in peace after conquering the world? I don't understand. These are probably the considerations of the important figures. We only need to do our part. Sigh, how I wish I could be younger by 8 to 10 years. Even if this old man is only 40 years old now, I'd still dare to go to the battlefield and fight those warmongers. How can the people live if there's a war every day? Yin Yang sighed inwardly. He calmed himself down and began to channel his mystical qi with all his might. There was really nothing he could do with his current physical condition. Instead of being anxious, it would be futile. It was better to try to recover quickly. After all, what he needed the most right now was to heal his injuries and recover his ability. Hopefully, he could still make it to the battlefield in time. Rush to the battlefield and join in the war that would determine Yutong's survival. Pfft! Yin Yang spat out a mouthful of blood, feeling weak all over. It was already the middle of the night. There was no progress in his body and cultivation method that he had set his heart on recovering. There was no other reason than that the meridians in Yin Yang's body were extremely fragile. Even the slightest movement of his breath would cause them to shatter instantly. How could he cultivate to his fullest potential? Yin Yang had already expected this, and knew that he could not be impatient. He could only take it slow, but the pain in his mind would still assault him from time to time. His internal organs also felt like they were doing somersaults in his stomach. The excruciating pain made it even more difficult for him to circulate his energy. Fortunately, the food that Yun Zuiyu had fed Yin Yang the other day was proving to be effective. The massive energy stored in his meridians and muscles was slowly being released now, repairing Yin Yang's body spontaneously. After multiple attempts, Yin Yang realized that he had to wait for the hidden energy to repair his meridians completely. Otherwise, any movement of his breath would trigger an excruciating pain in his meridians, as if his meridians were being torn apart. Forcefully doing so would even interrupt the healing process. Because of this, Yin Yang decided to do nothing but lie down and rest with his eyes closed. Early in the morning, another bowl of bitter medicinal soup was gulped down, waking Yin Yang up from his drowsiness. Yin Yang felt it and moved his body gently. He realized that the pain in his body had lessened, especially the tearing pain in his mind. As for the wounds all over his body, they were showing signs of healing. The old physician who had treated Yin Yang exclaimed that it was a miracle. With the severe injuries that Yin Yang had sustained, it would be hard for him to recover, even if he recuperated for a month or two. It was only reasonable that he would be bedridden forever, unable to recover. Unexpectedly, this patient had recovered so much in just one night. The vigor of life that he exuded was not what a severely injured patient should have. Of course, the old physician did not know what kind of mystical energy was stored in Yin Yang's body. It was only reasonable for him to have such an effect. If it were not for Emmy's disappearance, and the disappearance of his manifestation powers, the external and internal injuries were nothing to Yin Yang. To be able to recover to this extent within a day, you must be a remarkable figure, the old physician said respectfully. Although the old physician did not know Yin Yang's background, he could vaguely feel that Yin Yang was not an ordinary person, not even an ordinary cultivator. He could very well be a legendary ace cultivator, an unparalleled expert. You're too kind. I'm only a lowly soldier of Yutong. Yin Yang said respectfully. You're the true hero who saves the world. The old man smiled humbly. Grandfather. A youth's voice rang out. A youth around 15 or 16 years old walked in, the childishness still lingering on his face. He was carrying a large basket of frozen herbs on his back. It was really difficult for a child to find such a thing in such a snowy day. Just by looking at the travel-worn look on the youth's face, it was obvious that he was exhausted from the trip. You're back? Take a rest and catch your breath. Dinner will be served soon, the old man said kindly. Yes, grandfather. I have something to discuss with you. The youth's childish face was filled with hesitation. When the old man heard the word discuss, he shuddered inexplicably. His voice turned low as he said, If it's not important, don't discuss it anymore. Don't let our guests laugh at us. The youth bit his lips hesitantly and lowered his head. The tips of his feet pressed against the ground, his face flushed, but he could no longer say what he wanted to say. The old man sighed softly and said faintly, Speak. I want to go to the battlefield. The youth lifted his head abruptly and said, I want to go to war. I want to go to the battlefield. The old man's frail frame trembled again as he murmured, 13 years ago, your father said the same thing. He turned his head slowly to look outside the door and murmured, Then. The youth's eyes were red as he said, Dongshuan's traders have invaded my land. Yutong is in danger. I, your son, want to go to the battlefield. I want to avenge my father. I want to fight for Yutong. I want to kill the enemy. The youth knelt on the ground with a plop. Grandfather, the few of us have discussed it. We want to leave early tomorrow morning. How many of you? There are actually so many of you? The old man asked shakily. Who? Who else? Erniu Taiju Xuanzi Huzi Kaizi, there are 12 of us. The youth puffed up his chest and said, Uncles have all gone. We're all grown up now. It doesn't feel good to loiter around the village all day. We only feel humiliated every day now. We can kill the enemy and serve the country. Humiliated. The old man turned around slowly and said in a low voice, Even if you want to go, the families must agree. If all of you leave this village, other than women, children, and old men and women, there really isn't a single strong man left. The names that the youth mentioned were all the children in the village. The strong men in the village had all gone to the battlefield, So these children were the only strong laborers left in the village. They could be said to be the inheritors of the bloodline. The youth bit his lip and lowered his head in silence. Obviously, he understood the meaning of his grandfather's words. He really did. But then, the old man made up his mind and said, "Since you have decided to go, wait for another 2 days. Grandpa will help you pack up your luggage. Tonight, child, Grandpa will make delicious food for you and some dry rations. Then, let the aunties and grannies make clothes and cloth shoes for all of you. I'll let all of you fill your stomachs and travel warmly." No. Yun Yang, who was lying on the bed, sat up abruptly, his eyes gleaming. "At least wait for another 4 days. The youth turned to look at him and asked in surprise, "Why? Why do we have to wait for another 4 days? Yin Yang said in a low voice, "Because in these few days, all of you have to learn the art of killing on the battlefield from me. For yourselves and for your families at home. You have to increase your ability to kill the enemy and increase your ability to protect yourselves." The elder's murky eyes brightened and he asked worriedly, "Sir, your body?" Yun Yang endured the pain all over his body and said resolutely, "It's no longer a problem. Haven't you already felt that my body is getting better? The children have the heart to serve their country and are determined to go to war. I'll teach them some self-defense skills. When they're on the battlefield, at least, they'll have some ability to protect themselves. They'll have more ways to kill the enemy." The elder was moved to tears and said repeatedly, "Thank you, thank you." Although the old man was from a remote village, he was experienced in the ways of the world. How could he not know that the so-called self-defense skills were the cultivation methods of superior martial artists? The art was not easily taught. It was easy for Yin Yang to say it, but the old man dared not treat it lightly. Furthermore, the old man knew that anything could happen on the battlefield. The possibility of accidents happening to new recruits who did not know anything was too high, especially when they were at a disadvantage in terms of combat power. An ability that could increase one's combat power and protect one's life on the battlefield was indescribably precious. If this person in front of him could really teach his grandson the art of fighting on the battlefield, wouldn't that mean that his grandson would have countless more chances to escape death? The elder turned back and hollered, "What are you waiting for? Kowtow to your teacher." The youth was stunned and was about to kneel. Yun Yang was ashamed. There was nothing more he could do now. Forget about the fact that the old man had saved his life. Just looking at the fact that the child was still going forward despite knowing the dangers of the battlefield, he should help. He waved his hand forcefully and said, "There's no need for unnecessary formalities. There are only 2 days. Even if you want to learn more, I can only teach you some practical things. There's no need for kowtowing." In the afternoon of the same day, Yun Yang asked someone to carry him out. The group of teenagers who were prepared to go to war stood before him like tree stumps. There were 12 of them, not a single one missing. Each of the youth's eyes were trained on Yun Yang with a burning gaze. Killing on the battlefield is different from ordinary fights. The first thing you have to understand is that you're not afraid of death. On the battlefield, the more one is afraid of death, the faster he will die. Yun Yang endured the throbbing pain in his head and enunciated each word clearly. All of you don't need to know too much about other things. What you have to remember now is that on the battlefield, you must take good care of your comrades. This is one of the 2 strongest weapons for survival on the battlefield. Not afraid of death. Take good care of your comrades? The youths were obviously confused. Yes, these 2. The latter is even more important than the former. Yun Yang nodded seriously. Only when you're willing to block the saber for your comrades will your comrades block the arrow for you. Where did the saying brothers on the battlefield go through life and death together come from? It comes from this. Perhaps you will die for your comrades, or perhaps your comrades will die for you. But as long as everyone thinks of each other and protects their comrades, then their battle strength will increase by several times out of thin air. The youths did not fully understand Yun Yang's argument, but they bore it in mind. Not afraid of death. Take good care of your comrades. The 2 strongest weapons on the battlefield. The latter was even more important than the former. I can only move one hand now. Even if I force myself to move, I can only demonstrate it. I won't demonstrate it to you personally. Now that there are two of you, do as I say. I'll teach you some killing moves on the battlefield. First, with bare hands. How to use a saber. How to use a spear. You don't have to consider other weapons. There's no such thing as elegance on the battlefield. The two weapons I've mentioned just now are the weapons with the greatest lethality on the battlefield. The other weapons, like the long sword, are flashy but not practical. It's hard to put them to good use, so don't try to cultivate them. Besides, there are a lot of ownerless sabers and spears on the battlefield. Even if your own weapon is gone or broken, you can easily grab a weapon that fits your hand. Yun Yang watched as the youths practiced the skills they had just learned. Each of them knew that this was a way to save their lives, so they treated it seriously, not daring to be the slightest bit careless. Now I'll teach you the art of qi cultivation and breathing. Yun Yang thought about it and said, the effect of this art is effective. It won't make you martial artists or cultivators, but it complements the recovery of your physical strength on the battlefield. The effect is immediate. If you still want to learn something else, I'll teach you after you come back alive from the battlefield. Remember, if you can come back alive from the battlefield, I'll really teach you a profound cultivation method and embark on the path of cultivation. Of course, the youths did not know the weight of Yin Yang's promise. All they could do was nod with a silly smile. It was not that Yin Yang was being selfish and unwilling to impart the advanced cultivation method to these youths, but he knew that it was too late to impart any advanced cultivation method to them now. The war would probably be over by the time they could cultivate a cultivation method of that level. Just by the time they could sense the qi in their cultivation. Only the breathing method that Yin Yang had taught them that could recover their physical strength, and the method to train their muscles and bones were the most practical. For the rest of the afternoon and night, the youths were sweating in the yard as they trained diligently. No matter when, don't fight with all your strength. No matter what, you have to preserve some of your energy so that you have room to breathe. The comrades beside you are the closest people to you. On the battlefield, they're closer than parents and brothers. Don't look down on anyone, even if you can beat 10 of them with one hand. Even when you're the most tired, remember to shout the slogan. Yin Yang taught them patiently. When you're exhausted, shout the slogan together with others who are equally tired. It'll regenerate a surge of energy in your body that has no potential. This energy is called faith. What slogan should we shout then? What's the most useful slogan? A youth asked foolishly. Yin Yang thought about it and said, the most useful one is to shout that Yutong is undefeated. We have a home. For our parents, for our family, for the future. Brothers, let's fight. Yin Yang knew very well that such seemingly useless and aimless slogans could often be extraordinarily effective in a life-and-death moment on the battlefield. When a person shouted out the hot-bloodedness in his chest in a desperate situation, it would increase his strength inexplicably. At the very least, that strength would be able to support him to fight with his life on the line. The next day, Yin Yang was still urging the youths to cultivate, to practice killing, and to practice ways to preserve their lives. Only at night did they practice breathing in place of sleep. Although they had only been cultivating for a short period of time, the breathing method was effective immediately. Although the youths were still new to it, they could already feel the benefits of this method. Using it to replace sleep, not only would they not feel tired the next day, they would also be more focused. This further strengthened their belief in what Yin Yang had taught them. Yin Yang had gained a lot from this day and night as well. He could clearly feel the powerful potential within his body being unleashed faster and faster. The broken bones in his body were beginning to feel itchy, a sign that he was about to recover. Recover a little faster. Recover faster. It was the morning of the fourth day. Each of the youths was carrying a huge backpack, standing straight in front of Yin Yang. Yes, they were departing today. No matter how reluctant they were, they had to embark on this journey to war. In the bags on their backs were the rations, clothes, and a pair of cloth shoes with 1,000 soles that were finely stitched together. Almost all the resources of the entire village had been gathered in these backpacks. Some women stood on the road outside, trying their best not to let their children see their sorrow, but tears still fell uncontrollably. Thank you, teacher. There was a loud cry. The 12 youths knelt on the ground in unison and kowtowed to Yunyang 9 times. Yutong has the 9 supremes, so Yutong's most respectful greeting to others is to kowtow 9 times. To you, we must do so, even though you're not willing to admit that we're your disciples. In Yutong, as long as someone kowtowed to him 9 times out of gratitude, it meant that this person respected him as much as he respected the 9 supremes. This was the highest form of reverence, the highest form of respect. Get up, all of you, Yunyang said in a low voice. I have a letter that I need all of you to deliver. You must be going to the Fortress of Resilience, to the battlefield this time. No matter which of the 3 people you see, you can pass my letter to them. As long as you say that you're sent by young Master Yin, this trip will be safe. The 3 of them are called Fu Baogua, Qiu Jianhan, and Shengguan Lingxiu. She's a woman. Yunyang said seriously. If you don't see the 3 of them in person, don't take the letter out. Yes, Taizhu answered loudly. He was the oldest among the youths, already 18 this year. He was the leader of this group of children. He went forward to receive the letter respectfully and carefully placed it in the pocket of his shirt that was closest to his body. The others, including the elderly, felt that the first 2 names sounded familiar, as if they had heard them somewhere before, but they did not think too much about it. After all, no one would have thought that a soldier who had been crippled on the battlefield would actually know the 2 marshals of the empire. They did not know that this letter, this message, was the true life-saving talisman of the 12 youths. If they ask me about young Master Yun's whereabouts, just tell them that I'll be there soon. Half a month at most, Yunyang said. Also, all of you must use the breathing method I've taught you. Even if you're sleeping during the journey, don't slack off for even a moment. It's best if you can make it your instinct and get used to it. Practice your combat skills every day. No less than 6 hours are allowed, no matter how tiring the journey is. That's the foundation for your survival on the battlefield. Do you understand? The youth's eyes glowed as they committed every word to memory, etching it deep into their hearts. The entire village carried Yunyang to send the 12 youths off. Everyone was smiling. Go in peace. This is the time for men to use their martial arts, to kill the enemy and serve the country, to make contributions. We're here at home. You don't have to worry about anything. The 12 youths knelt at the end of the road and kowtowed respectfully to the entire village. They then stood up and turned to leave, not a single one of them looking back. The morning sun shone on their backs like they were covered in a layer of colorful clouds. Seeing that the youths' silhouettes could no longer be seen, sorrowful cries could be heard from the crowd that was sending them off. The ultimate battle of millions of troops from both empires. The ultimate battle that would decide the fate and well-being of the nation. The extreme battle that would annihilate an entire nation. How much could the strength of 12 youths be worth? These 12 youths would probably be drowned by the army once they reached the battlefield. Would they be able to see them return safely in this lifetime? Who knew how many of them would return when the 12 of them left today? No one had the slightest confidence in this. There was only hope, only blessings. How many youths in the entire empire of Yutong would step into the battlefield with their blood boiling? The feelings of these thousands of families were the same. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.